Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the sacred grounds where silence should reign eternal, yet the restless refuse to rest. In this episode we bring you 8 disturbing accounts of encounters within the hallowed corridors of our nation's cemeteries and graveyards. From the windswept headstones of Colorado to the moss-laden crypts of Louisiana, these testimonies emerge from individuals who dared to walk among the dead and discovered that some graves cannot contain what lies beneath. Each story has been reconstructed from detailed witness accounts, police reports, and first-hand testimonials of those who experienced the unexplainable in these places of eternal rest. The voices you will hear belong to groundskeepers who worked the midnight shift, visitors paying respects to loved ones, and investigators who stumbled upon phenomena that defied rational explanation. To preserve the dignity of the deceased and protect the privacy of the living witnesses, certain identifying details, including specific cemetery names and personal information, have been carefully altered. If you are new to Buried Files, make sure to subscribe for daily true horror content that unearths the darkest corners of human experience. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we excavate another collection of buried truths that refuse to stay dead. The old man's hands were stained with decades of Colorado soil. Weathered fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee as the autumn sun dipped behind the Rocky Mountain peaks. Calvin Brooks had been the caretaker of Hillcrest Cemetery for 37 years, and in all that time he had never spoken about what he witnessed on those crisp October nights when the veil between worlds grew thin. "You want to know about the lantern?" Calvin said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in silence. The shadows lengthened across the weathered headstones as he settled back in his wooden chair on the cemetery office porch. "Most folks around here, they heard the stories, but they never lived with it like I have." Calvin's weathered face turned toward the rows of granite markers that stretched into the gathering dusk. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the small mountain town of Silver Cliff, population barely 800 souls. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets had a way of festering in the thin mountain air until they became something else entirely. The kind of place where whispered conversations behind the post office carried more weight than headlines in the Denver papers. "Started back in 1987, Calvin continued, his breath visible in the cooling air. October 15th to be exact. I remember because it was the night after old Martha Hendricks was laid to rest. She'd lived in this town for 93 years, never married, never had children, spent her whole life taking care of other people's business, knowing every secret, every shame, every buried truth this town tried to forget. Martha Hendricks had been the town librarian for 62 years, a position that gave her access to more than just books and periodicals. People trusted librarians with their private conversations, their hushed phone calls, their desperate searches through old newspaper archives. Martha had witnessed decades of cover-ups, lies told to protect reputations, and documents that mysteriously disappeared when they threatened powerful families. She kept meticulous records in her personal journal, documenting every suspicious transaction, every unexplained death, every family that suddenly left town. The first time Calvin saw the light, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He had been making his evening rounds, checking that the day's burial service had been properly cleaned up. The funeral director from Pueblo always left behind small messes that Calvin took pride in correcting. Scattered rose petals, folding chairs not properly stacked, programs blowing against headstones in the mountain wind. As he walked between the headstones, collecting forgotten flowers and straightening American flags, he noticed a soft glow emanating from somewhere near the back section of the cemetery. "Figured it was some kids with flashlights," Calvin explained, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "We get them. Sometimes teenagers thinking they're brave enough to spend a night among the dead. Usually they scatter like rabbits when they hear my boots crunching through the gravel. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't no flashlight. This light, it moved different. Had a quality to it that made the hair on my arms stand up, made my teeth ache like before a thunderstorm. The light appeared to be coming from an old-fashioned lantern, the kind with a glass chimney and metal frame that miners used to carry deep into the Colorado mountains. The brass fittings had developed a greenish patina, and the glass was clouded with age, yet the flame inside burned with intensity that seemed to come from another world entirely. It hovered about 3 feet off the ground, swaying gently as if carried by invisible hands. The warm yellow glow cast long shadows between the headstones, creating shapes that seemed to writhe and dance in Calvin's peripheral vision. Calvin approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. In all his years tending to the dead, he had never felt the kind of primal fear that gripped him in that moment. The temperature seemed to drop with each step he took toward the mysterious light, and the familiar sounds of the mountain evening, the rustle of aspen leaves, the distant call of an owl faded into unnatural silence. The lantern moved with purpose, following what appeared to be the old walking paths that connected different sections of the cemetery. Paths that had been established when the graveyard was first consecrated in 1892. Paths that most people had forgotten existed beneath decades of fallen leaves. The strangest part, Calvin said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, was that the light seemed to know where it was going. It would pause at certain graves, hover there for maybe 30 seconds, then move on to the next one. Always the same pattern, always the same graves, like it was reading something written on the headstones that I couldn't see. Over the following weeks, Calvin began to document which graves the lantern visited. He kept a small notebook in his jacket pocket, jotting down dates and times and locations. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Every grave the lantern lingered over belonged to someone who had died with unfinished business in Silver Cliff. Martha Hendricks was just the beginning of a pattern that stretched back generations. There was Thomas Kellerman, who had died in a car accident in 1973. 3 days before he was supposed to testify in a corruption case involving the town's former mayor. His vehicle had skidded off Highway 24 in perfect weather conditions, crashing into a stand of aspen trees with suspicious force. Rebecca Walsh, who passed away from a heart attack in 1981 while investigating financial irregularities at the local bank. She had been 38 years old with no prior heart problems, found clutching a manila folder filled with evidence that disappeared before the coroner arrived. James Moreau, who died of pneumonia in 1958 after spending months trying to prove that his business partner had been embezzling funds from their mining operation. Each one of them died before they could expose the truth about something, Calvin said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he set down his coffee cup. Each one of them took secrets to their graves that could have changed this town forever. Could have saved other people from being cheated, lied to, maybe even killed. The lantern appeared every night for 3 weeks straight. Calvin found himself drawn to watch its nightly journey, following at a respectful distance as it moved between the headstones. The October air grew colder each evening, frost beginning to form on the marble angels and granite crosses. He began to notice that the light grew brighter on certain nights, particularly when the wind carried voices from town up the hill to the cemetery. Voices arguing behind closed doors, voices making deals in dark alleyways, voices covering up truths that needed to be spoken. On those nights, the lantern would pulse with urgent rhythm, as if responding to the corruption that continued to poison the town below. On November 7th, exactly 23 days after Martha Hendricks was buried, the lantern's behavior changed. Instead of following its usual route through the cemetery, it moved directly to Calvin's office. It hovered outside his window, casting that warm yellow glow across his desk, where he kept his documentation of the nightly visits. The light pulsed gently as if trying to get his attention, as if it had something urgent to communicate. Calvin opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The lantern hung in the air just beyond his reach, swaying gently in the mountain breeze. For the first time since the appearances began, Calvin felt no fear. Instead, he felt profound sadness, as if the light itself was mourning for all the truths that would never be told, all the justice that would never be served, all the innocent people who had suffered because good people had died too soon. "I understood then," Calvin said, his voice thick with emotion. "The lantern wasn't trying to scare anybody. It was trying to remind us. Remind us that some debts don't get settled just because someone dies. Some promises don't get broken just because the person who made them is 6 feet under." The next morning, Calvin walked into the Silver Cliff Police Department and handed over his notebook. Every entry, every observation, every pattern he had documented during those 3 weeks of nightly visits. He told Chief Morrison about Martha Hendricks' investigation into the town's missing municipal funds, about the ledger she had hidden in the library basement. He explained how Thomas Kellerman had discovered evidence of vote manipulation in the 1972 mayoral election. He detailed Rebecca Walsh's findings about the systematic overcharging of elderly customers at Morrison's family-owned bank. Chief Morrison listened to every word, Calvin continued, didn't interrupt once. When I finished talking, he closed my notebook and told me he'd look into it. 2 days later, he arrested his own uncle for embezzlement. 3 days after that, they found the missing municipal funds in an account belonging to the former mayor's widow. The arrests didn't stop there. Within a month, half the town council had been indicted for corruption. Property that had been illegally seized was returned to rightful owners. Families who had been cheated out of insurance settlements finally received justice. The truth had a way of spreading once it was allowed to breathe. The lantern appeared one final time on November 15th, exactly 1 month after Martha Hendricks was buried. Calvin watched from his office window as it made its usual rounds, pausing at each grave where it had lingered before. But this time was different. At each stop, the light seemed to pulse 3 times, like a signal or farewell. When it reached Martha's grave, it hovered there for nearly 10 minutes before slowly fading away, leaving behind the faintest scent of kerosene and mountain wildflowers. Calvin finished his coffee as full darkness settled over the cemetery. The mountain air carried the scent of approaching snow, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled its lonesome song to the stars. The familiar sounds of the Colorado evening had returned. The whisper of wind through pine branches, the distant rumble of a freight train crossing the valley. "Never saw the light again after that night," he said, standing slowly from his chair. "But I learned something important. Sometimes the dead don't rest because the living won't listen. Sometimes the only way to find peace is to finish what was started, even if it takes 37 years and a mysterious lantern to show you the way." Calvin gathered his empty coffee cup and turned toward his small cottage at the edge of the cemetery grounds. "The dead have their own sense of justice," he called back over his shoulder. "And in Silver Cliff, justice has a way of finding the light." As Calvin disappeared into the gathering darkness, a soft breeze rustled through the pine trees that bordered the cemetery. For just a moment, just long enough to make a person wonder, a faint yellow glow seemed to flicker between the headstones before vanishing into the Colorado night. Some say that on clear autumn evenings, when corruption threatens to take root in Silver Cliff again, the lantern still appears to those who know how to look. "Drive faster, Lily. She's still there," Marcus shouted from the passenger seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the dashboard. The speedometer needle climbed past 70 as Lily Ramirez pressed harder on the accelerator, her Honda Civic racing down Archer Avenue through the dark Illinois countryside. "I'm trying," Lily's voice cracked as she checked the rearview mirror. Behind them, the iron gates of Resurrection Cemetery grew smaller, but the image of what they had witnessed burned bright in both their minds. The pale figure in the white dress standing motionless in their headlights before vanishing like morning mist. It had started as a dare 3 hours earlier. Lily's co-workers at the Chicago Tribune had been sharing ghost stories during their late shift, and someone mentioned the legend of Resurrection Mary, the phantom hitchhiker who supposedly haunted the stretch of road between the Willowbrook Ballroom and Resurrection Cemetery in Justice, Illinois. Marcus, who worked in sports and had been trying to ask Lily out for months, volunteered to drive with her to investigate. "It's probably just local folklore," Lily had said, gathering her notebook and camera. At 26, she had built a reputation as a skeptical journalist who specialized in debunking urban legends. But it might make for an interesting Halloween feature. Now, as they put distance between themselves and the cemetery, Lily was questioning everything she thought she knew about the supernatural. Her hands trembled as she finally slowed the car, pulling into a 24-hour diner in nearby Burbank. "Tell me what you saw," Lily said once they were seated in a corner booth, both nursing cups of black coffee. The fluorescent lights felt reassuring after the darkness of Archer Avenue, but neither could shake what had happened. Marcus ran his hands through his dark hair. "Same thing you saw. We were driving past the cemetery around midnight, and there she was, standing right in the middle of the road wearing that white ball gown. You hit the brakes so hard I thought we were going to slide into her." Lily nodded, replaying the scene. She had been driving the speed limit when the figure appeared in their headlights. A young woman with pale skin and dark hair wearing an elaborate white dress that seemed to glow in the darkness. She had been standing perfectly still, not moving to get out of the way, showing no fear at the approaching vehicle. "But when I got out to check on her," Lily continued, "she was gone. Completely gone. And the temperature dropped at least 20 degrees. That was the part that disturbed Lily most. As a journalist, she was trained to observe details, to look for logical explanations. But there had been nowhere for the woman to hide. The road was straight with open fields on both sides. No trees, no buildings, no ditches deep enough to conceal a person. The woman had simply vanished. My grandmother used to tell stories about Resurrection Mary," Marcus said quietly. "She grew up in this neighborhood back in the 40s. Said her older sister claimed to have picked up a hitchhiker on Archer Avenue one night. Beautiful girl in a white dress who asked to be taken to the cemetery. When they got there, the girl just disappeared from the back seat. Over the next week, Lily threw herself into researching the legend. She spent hours in the Chicago Public Library archives looking through old newspaper clippings and police reports. What she found surprised her. The stories went back decades with dozens of documented encounters involving a female hitchhiker who matched the same description. The earliest report she could find was from 1939, when a taxi driver claimed to have picked up a young woman outside the Willowbrook Ballroom. The woman, dressed in a white ball gown, asked to be taken to Resurrection Cemetery. When they arrived, she vanished from the back seat without paying the fare. The driver insisted he had locked the doors and never heard them open. Similar stories appeared in police reports throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Always the same pattern. A young woman in white, picked up along Archer Avenue asking to go to the cemetery, then vanishing without explanation. Some witnesses described her as warm to the touch and completely solid. Others said she felt cold and seemed to glow faintly. Lily interviewed retired Chicago police officers who had worked the area during the height of the sightings. Detective Raymond Kowalski, now 78, remembered taking multiple reports about the mysterious hitchhiker during his career. "We always took the calls seriously," Kowalski told her during an interview at his South Side home. Most of the witnesses were solid citizens. Business people, nurses getting off late shifts, couples driving home from dates, not the type to make up stories. The detective showed Lily a file he had kept from his active duty days, filled with witness statements and incident reports. One case from 1976 particularly caught her attention. A young man named David Martinez had reported picking up a female hitchhiker on Archer Avenue around 11:30 at night. She was standing by the side of the road near the cemetery entrance, Martinez had told police. Beautiful girl, maybe 20 years old, wearing a white formal dress. She seemed upset, like she'd been crying. When I asked where she needed to go, she just said home and pointed toward the cemetery. Martinez described driving the woman to the cemetery gates, where she asked him to stop. When he turned to ask if she needed help getting inside, she was gone. The passenger door was still closed and locked, but the seat was empty. Martinez had immediately driven to the nearest police station to report the incident. The strange thing, Detective Kowalski explained, was that Martinez mentioned the girl felt cold when she got in the car. Not just cool skin, but actually cold, like she'd been standing outside in winter weather. But it was July, and the temperature that night was in the 80s. Lily found similar details in other witness accounts. The mysterious woman always felt unnaturally cold to the touch. She rarely spoke beyond asking to go to the cemetery or simply saying home, and she invariably disappeared when the vehicle reached the cemetery gates, leaving no trace except for the lingering scent of roses and vanilla. The most compelling evidence came from a 1983 incident that had been photographed by accident. A couple returning from their wedding reception had stopped to help what they thought was a stranded motorist near Resurrection Cemetery. The bride had taken several pictures to document their special day. When the film was developed, one photograph showed a figure in white standing near the cemetery gates, but the woman who had flagged them down was nowhere to be seen. The image was grainy and unclear, but it clearly showed someone in an old-fashioned white dress where no such person should have been visible. Lily spent an afternoon at the cemetery, walking the grounds and talking to groundskeepers. The cemetery, established in 1904, contained thousands of graves dating back over a century. She found several graves of young women who had died in the 30s and 40s, any one of whom could potentially match the description of Resurrection Mary. One grave in particular caught her attention. Anna Maria Norcus, who had died in 1927 at the age of 22. According to cemetery records, Anna had been killed in a car accident while returning home from a dance at the O. Henry Ballroom, which later became the Willowbrook Ballroom. She had been wearing a white beaded dress when she died and was buried in the same gown. The timing fits, Lily told Marcus as they sat in her apartment, surrounded by research materials. The first reported sightings of Resurrection Mary began about 12 years after Anna's death. And the location matches perfectly. She died on Archer Avenue, not far from where people claim to see the hitchhiker. 2 weeks after their encounter, Lily decided to return to Archer Avenue. This time she went alone, armed with a digital camera and voice recorder. She wanted to approach the investigation objectively without emotional influence. She parked near the cemetery entrance around 11:30, the same time most sightings were reported. The October night was clear and cold, with a full moon casting long shadows across the roadway. Lily sat in her car for nearly an hour, watching and waiting. At 12:15, she saw headlights approaching from the direction of the Willowbrook Ballroom. A pickup truck slowed as it passed the cemetery, then came to a complete stop about 50 yards ahead. The driver got out and walked to the passenger side of his vehicle, opening the door as if letting someone out. Lily started her engine and drove closer, pulling alongside the truck. The driver, a middle-aged man in work clothes, looked confused and frightened. "Did you see where she went?" he asked Lily through her open window. "Where who went?" "The girl I picked up back at the ballroom. Young lady in a white dress. She asked me to bring her here to the cemetery, but when I stopped to let her out, she was gone. Doors still locked, but the seats empty." Lily felt a chill run down her spine. She had just witnessed the Resurrection Mary phenomenon from a different perspective, seeing another driver experience exactly what she and Marcus had encountered 2 weeks earlier. "This has happened before," Lily told the man, introducing herself as a journalist. "You're not crazy, and you're not the first person to experience this." The man, who identified himself as Robert Chen, a construction worker from nearby Oak Lawn, seemed relieved to hear that others had similar experiences. He described the hitchhiker exactly as Lily remembered her: young, pale, wearing an elaborate white dress with dark hair styled in vintage waves. "She seemed so real," Chen said. "We talked during the drive. She told me her name was Mary and that she was trying to get home. Her hands were ice cold when I helped her into the truck, but I figured she'd been waiting outside for a while." Lily interviewed Chen for over an hour, documenting every detail of his encounter. His story matched the historical reports almost perfectly, adding another piece to the puzzle of Resurrection Mary. 3 months later, Lily published her article about Resurrection Mary in the Chicago Tribune Sunday edition. She presented the historical evidence, the witness testimonies, and her own experience with journalistic objectivity, allowing readers to draw their own conclusions. The article generated hundreds of responses from readers who claimed to have had similar encounters along Archer Avenue. Some described picking up the mysterious hitchhiker, others reported seeing her walking alone near the cemetery. A few readers shared family stories that had been passed down for generations, adding to the rich folklore surrounding the phantom of Resurrection Cemetery. But for Lily, the most significant outcome was personal. The experience had challenged her skeptical worldview and opened her mind to possibilities she had never considered. She continued to investigate paranormal phenomena throughout her career, always approaching each case with the same rigorous methodology she had applied to the Resurrection Mary story. And sometimes, on clear October nights when the moon is full, Lily still drives down Archer Avenue past the cemetery gates. Not as a skeptical journalist looking to debunk a legend, but as someone who knows that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some stories are too powerful to be explained away, and some spirits refuse to rest until they find their way home. The letter arrived pressed beneath a bouquet of dried magnolia leaves, edges browned and curling from the Louisiana heat. It was addressed to Miss Clara Everett, Ashland, Oregon, in a slanted, looping hand that immediately brought a lump to her throat. Just the sight of the return address, Maplewood Cemetery Office, St. James Parish, Louisiana, made Clara clutch the envelope with trembling fingers. Miles Everett had been the caretaker of Maplewood for almost 12 years, ever since his father's death. That cemetery was old in the way only southern cemeteries could be, with wrought iron arches, mausoleums buckling under strangler vines, and statues with watching eyes. Miles was younger than most caretakers, 41, broad-shouldered, with a battered Red Sox cap he wore in every season, and a way of moving that suggested he had never forgotten to check over his shoulder. He wrote to his sister when the weight of his job pressed too hard on his chest, and some buried family secret threatened to burst forth like a yellow jacket's hive beneath the grass. Clara, reading his letter from 1,000 miles away, heard the tremor in her brother's words. It was more pronounced this time, and as she read, she kept brushing at an imagined tickle along her forearms, the kind that comes when the air gets heavy before a southern storm. "Dear Clara, last night the statues started whispering again. It had been 2 years since the last time. You remember what I wrote then? The night after we put Father in the ground and I was sitting by the old Carter mausoleum thinking about what you said about moving north. I heard the bronze angel by the east gate murmur my name. 'Everett,' she said, so soft I thought it was the wind in the Spanish moss. But pretty soon every angel, cherub, and draped lady in that half-acre started in, hissing words I could not understand, all at once, until I had to press my hands to my ears. Clara, I thought I was losing my mind. I checked every inch of the cemetery by lantern light, found nothing but my own footprints in the dew. But last night, It was worse. It started at dusk. I was by the Grant plot, pruning the wild blackberries from around the iron rail. There was a breeze, just enough to rustle the leaves, and then I heard it. Whispers, clear as day this time, like stone lips pressed against the air. It was not just one statue, but many, chiming in one after the other, names and dates, and then... He paused in the letter with a long blank space, as if trying to protect her from what came next. Clara found herself holding her breath. One of them said your name. It was not my voice, and it was not anything human, but it said Clara, sure as sunrise. It called to me 3 times before it stopped. You must believe me, I am not making this up. I have kept myself alert, writing down times and locations, documenting the events like an investigator. Even took the old tape recorder you sent me for my birthday and turned it on during my rounds. I will mail you the cassette if you want, but I can hardly bear to hear it myself. I know you are thinking of Father, how his mind went toward the end. But this is real. The groundskeeper's dog would not come within 100 yards after dark. I found the candles I set at the grave sites blown out, stands knocked over as if by a strong, directed wind, though the air was still all evening. The sheriff dropped by at sundown, asking after stories of stolen flowers. The neighbors down on Chapel Street had complained, said they kept hearing what sounded like a woman singing after midnight, coming from among the graves. I do not know what to do, Clara. Something is wrong in Maplewood. Your brother, Miles. Clara read those words over and over, searching for reason in the gaps. The image of her brother out at dusk with only his lantern and the iron gates behind him brought back the worst of their childhood memories. Their father standing watch on their old porch, hammer in hand, muttering about shadows that move on their own, and their mother insisting on prayers for restless souls. She had always dismissed it as the superstition of old Louisiana, no more substantial than the stories traded at the corner store. She called Miles the next morning. The phone rang for a long time before his weary voice answered. He sounded older than she remembered, gravelly and slow, as if sleep had not come for days. I am telling you because no one else would believe it, he said before Clara could ask. It is not just noises or flickering shadows. The statues move, only when you are not looking directly. I catch them out of the corner of my eye. Sometimes they are looking at me when before they face the road. Sometimes a hand is extended that was never sculpted before, or a mouth open where there was none. I have pictures, I can send them, he did later that afternoon. The images arrived by email. Each photo showed some subtle, unexplainable shift. The mourning angel beside the Mayfield grave with a different set of rosaries in her folded hands. The marble cherub whose face bore fresh streaks as if from spent tears. She studied them late into the night, comparing them to the cemetery's archived photos. The differences were undeniable. Miles began to call Clara nightly. Every evening as dusk settled, so too did his dread. He could not bring himself to quit his job. The Everetts had been caretakers for generations. Instead, he documented everything. On the 3rd night, he told her about the dream. I was standing in the center of the cemetery, looking at the rows of statues. It was twilight, the hour when the solar lights flicker on. All the statues, every one of them, turned to face me at once. They spoke not in English, but in voices like wind through iron gates and rain on stone. I woke up in a sweat, and when I went outside, every single statue was facing the main path. That has never happened before. I rotated a few of them back myself, but in the morning they were all turned forward again. Word got out among the locals that something was wrong at Maplewood. The sheriff's deputies began refusing to patrol the cemetery at night, and the groundskeeper quit after his dog refused to go near the east gate, howling at nothing and clawing madly at the chain-link fence. The florist who supplied bouquets for the old family's tombs found her arrangements wilting overnight, petals blackened as if burned by acid. Rumors spread. Stories of children gone missing a century before, of deals made with voodoo priests and broken oaths by the first settlers. The priests at St. James would not come to bless the grounds, even when Miles offered double their usual fee. "The dead are uneasy," one old priest said, not meeting Miles's eyes. "Something is unfinished here." Even the city tried to avoid the place, blaming the strange happenings on sulfur vents under the marsh and magnetic anomalies. But the local news, sniffing a story, sent a young reporter to Maplewood to spend the night for a Halloween segment. He left before midnight, pale and tight-lipped, refusing to speak to anyone for a week. Clara scoured archives and newspaper records from across the state. All she found was the cemetery's strange history, an unclaimed mausoleum moved stone by stone from another county, a rash of vandalized statues in the late 1950s, a string of thunderstorms that had felled the oldest oak tree and split several grave markers. She called a retired professor from Tulane, an expert on Louisiana folk traditions. "Whispering statues? That is a story for the bayous," the professor said. "Older than any written record. It means the dead want something. The statues, they say, can become vessels for unspoken wishes, regrets, unfinished truths, especially where the earth is soft and the water runs near. If the whispers turn to wailing, leave and do not turn back." Meanwhile, Miles kept sending letters to his sister. Diagrams of statue placements, lists of names the statues seemed to whisper, and disturbing sketches of a particular figure. A pale, androgynous angel, crack running down one cheek, standing atop a square marble plinth at the heart of the oldest row. "Every night, that angel turns more and more towards the house," he wrote. "Last night I thought I heard it whisper Everett again. You should not come down here no matter what. I am trying to do some research before I go to the city officials. Something is not right with that statue." Several nights later, Miles called Clara, voice breaking. "Clara, tonight the whispering turned to pleading. I swear they said, 'Let us rest. Find the key. Let us rest.' Over and over. It was so loud I thought the neighbors would wake and come running. I walked through the rows until I reached the old communal crypt, the one with the locked iron door nobody has the key for. As I got close, the voices stopped all at once. The angel atop the crypt almost looked like it smiled." Clara pressed him for details. "What key? Did you ever find a key when Father died?" "Nothing like that. But I will look through the old desk in the office. If I find anything, I will call." That night turned to morning, then another sleepless day. At dusk, another letter came. "Clara, I found the key, wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of Father's desk drawer. There was a note tied to it in his writing. 'When the voices rise, return what was taken.' I think I understand. Decades ago, a section of the cemetery was walled off during an epidemic. The city removed remains and reburied them in the communal crypt, but the records say not all personal effects were returned. Old superstition says the spirits would not rest unless all that was taken from them was given back. I am going to the crypt at midnight, alone. Your brother?" Miles. Clara tried to call. No answer. Panicked, she called the sheriff, but the deputies, remembering the other night's whistling, refused to go, promising only to check at dawn. The next day, a single voicemail from Miles appeared on her phone, time-stamped 1:12 a.m. The static was so thick it scraped her ears. Through the distortion, she heard her brother's breath, ragged and fast, and a low chorus in the background, voices building and falling like the tide. Then, his whisper, "I am back at the crypt. The statues are all around me. The key fits. I am going to open it now, Clara," and then screaming metal, a sound like shifting stone, and the call cut out. He was gone. No one had seen him leave. The groundskeeper found the old communal crypt door standing open, nothing disturbed inside except for a pile of small ancient trinkets, beads and lockets, watches and pins, all laid out in the shape of a cross. The angel atop the tomb now faced away from the path and towards the swamp, its expression peaceful for the first time in living memory. Days passed. Then one evening, as the sun slipped behind the moss-draped branches, Clara received a final letter. The envelope was old and the edges soot-stained, but the handwriting was unmistakable, her brother's hand. Clara, all is quiet now. The statues do not whisper anymore. I am safe, or as safe as one can be on holy ground. The dreams are gone. I hope you never have to see what I saw. If ever you need to find me, come to Maplewood at dusk and listen. The statues will only whisper welcome. Your brother, Miles. To this day, visitors to Maplewood Cemetery sometimes report as twilight falls that the statues seem to shift ever so slightly. Their lips pursed as if holding a silent message, their stone hands poised as though about to beckon. And if they listen very closely on certain humid Louisiana evenings, they say you can almost catch a gentle sigh across the crypts. A whisper of thanks, of peace, finally, found. I need to write this down while it's still fresh because honestly, I don't know if I'll believe it myself tomorrow. I'm sitting in my hotel room, hands still shaking, and I can't get the image out of my head. Today I decided to take that cemetery tour I've been putting off. St. Louis Cemetery Number 1, the one everyone calls the most haunted place in New Orleans. Perfect for my Halloween content series, right? The tour was supposed to end at 4 p.m., but I convinced the guide to let me stay behind for solo photos. Big mistake. Earlier today, 2:30 p.m. The tour group was typical. 15 tourists with cameras, college kids trying to look unimpressed, and one guy who kept asking if we'd see Marie Laveau's ghost. Our guide, Patricia, was this tiny Creole woman in her 60s who knew every story about every tomb. She kept warning us not to wander off and definitely not to stay after dark. The dead in St. Louis number 1, they don't all rest easy, she said, stopping in front of a crumbling above-ground vault. Some of them still got business with the living. I was getting great shots. Afternoon light filtering through massive oak trees, weathered marble angels, elaborate ironwork like black lace against white tombs. This place is like a miniature city of the dead, with narrow pathways between vaults that rise up like tiny houses. Patricia told us about famous residents, Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen, whose tomb is covered in X marks from visitors seeking her help. But she also told darker stories about yellow fever epidemics that filled the cemetery faster than graves could be dug. The cemetery closes at 3 p.m. sharp, Patricia warned as the tour ended. Security locks the gates and you don't want to be trapped in here after sunset. 4:15 p.m. after the tour. I convinced Patricia I was a travel blogger and asked to stay 30 more minutes for photos. She looked at me like I'd asked to spend the night in a haunted house. Child, I've been giving tours here for 23 years. When that sun starts going down, you get yourself to the exit gate. But I'm stubborn. My followers expect authentic content, right? I convinced the security guard, showed him my press credentials, promised I'd be out by 5 p.m. He reluctantly agreed, but made me sign a waiver. The moment the tour group left, the atmosphere changed. It was still daylight, but shadows between the tombs seemed deeper. I was alone among hundreds of graves, and for the first time, that felt significant. 5 p.m., the encounter. I was photographing Marie Laveau's tomb when I heard crying. Soft at first, like someone trying to muffle their sobs. The crying got louder, coming from deeper in the cemetery. I followed the sound, thinking maybe someone else had gotten permission to stay late. That's when I saw her. She was the steps of a white marble tomb, hunched over with her face in her hands. She wore a long white dress that looked like it belonged in another century. Lots of lace, long sleeves, a full skirt that pooled around her feet. Her hair was dark and long, hanging loose around her shoulders. What struck me first was that she was barefoot. Her feet were dirty like she'd been walking on unpaved ground for hours. "Are you okay?" I called out. The crying stopped immediately. She looked up at me and my heart stopped. Her face was beautiful but wrong somehow. Too pale, like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her eyes were dark and seemed too large for her face, but it was her expression that made me want to run. Such profound sadness that tears sprang to my own eyes. "You should not be here," she said. Her voice was soft with an accent I couldn't place. Not quite Creole, not quite French, but something older. "The sun is setting." I looked around. She was right. Somehow the light had faded to golden hour. Long shadows stretched between tombs. "I'm just finishing up some photos," I said. "Are you visiting someone?" She stood up slowly and I noticed she moved like she was floating. Her bare feet made no sound on the stone steps. "I am always here," she said. "I wait for those who do not listen to warnings." Something in her tone made my skin crawl. I took a step back, suddenly very aware that I was alone in a cemetery with someone who might not be stable. "I should go. The cemetery is closing soon." "Soon?" She tilted her head, and in the fading light her face seemed to shift. For just a moment I could have sworn I saw hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, skin like old parchment. But then she was beautiful again, just incredibly sad. "The cemetery closed an hour ago," she said. "The gates are locked. You are trapped here until dawn." My blood went cold. I pulled out my phone to call the security guard, but there was no signal. "That's not possible," I said. "The guard knows I'm here." She shook her head slowly. "He left. They always leave before dark. No one stays in St. Louis number 1 after sunset. No one living." I started walking quickly toward the front of the cemetery, but the path seemed different, longer, more twisted. The crying woman followed me, her bare feet silent on stone. "You should have listened," she said, keeping pace effortlessly. "Patricia warned you. She always warns them, but some never listen." "Who are you?" I asked. "I am what happens to those who stay too long. I am the warning that comes too late." I reached the front gate and rattled the iron bars, locked tight. The security booth was dark and empty. The woman stood behind me, and when I turned around, she was crying again. But now, in the last light of day, I could see that her tears were black. "Every night I wait here," she whispered. "Every night someone new joins me." I looked around desperately. The cemetery was much larger than it had seemed during the tour. Paths stretched in directions that hadn't existed before, and everywhere in the shadows between vaults I could see pale figures moving. "How do I get out?" I asked. "You don't. Not until dawn, but dawn is many hours away." 10:30 p.m. Still here. I've been writing this on my phone to keep myself sane. The battery is at 12%, but I need to document this. The crying woman was right. I'm trapped here until sunrise. She disappeared around 7 p.m., just faded away like mist. But I'm not alone. There are others here. Shadows that move between tombs. Whispers in languages I don't recognize. I found a sheltered spot between two large mausoleums. Every time I try to explore, the paths seem to shift. I end up back where I started. The temperature has dropped 20 degrees. My breath is visible, which is impossible for October in New Orleans. 2:15 a.m. Something's changed. The crying woman is back. She's sitting on Marie Laveau's tomb now, and she's not alone. There are others, men in old-fashioned suits, women in Victorian dresses, children in clothes from decades past. They're all sitting on various tombs, all perfectly still, all watching me. None of them are solid. I can see through them to the marble behind, but their eyes are so real, so full of sorrow. The crying woman beckoned to me. Against every instinct, I walked over to her. "You understand now," she said. "This place holds more than bodies. It holds the last moments of grief, the final tears of mourning. We are the sorrow that soaked into these stones over 2 centuries. What do you want from me? To witness, to remember, to carry our stories back to the living world. Too many come here seeking thrills. They don't understand that we were people once. We had names, lives, loves, losses. She told me her story then. Her name was Celeste Trem, and she had died in the yellow fever epidemic of 1853. She was 19 years old, engaged to be married in 2 weeks. She died alone in a charity hospital while her fiancé was traveling, and by the time he returned, she had already been buried in a mass grave. I have been waiting here ever since, she said, waiting for someone to remember my name, to know that I existed, that I loved and was loved. The other spirits began to speak then one by one. Each had a story, a name, a life cut short. They weren't trying to scare me, they were trying to be remembered. 5:45 a.m. Dawn approaches. The eastern sky is starting to lighten. The spirits are beginning to fade. Celeste is the last to go. You will leave now, she said, when the gate will open with the sunrise. But you will remember us, yes? You will tell their stories. I promised I would. As the first real light of dawn touched the tombs, I heard the click of the front gate unlocking. The fog lifted and the paths returned to their normal layout. I walked out of St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 and into the awakening French Quarter. I looked back once. The cemetery looked ordinary in the morning light, just an old graveyard full of weathered tombs. But I could still feel their eyes on me, still hear the echo of Celeste's voice asking me to remember. Final thoughts. I don't know if anyone will believe this story. I have no photos of the spirits. Every picture I took after sunset shows only empty tombs and shadows. But I have their names, their stories, their final requests. Maybe that's what really haunts places like St. Louis No. 1. Not malevolent ghosts seeking revenge, but forgotten souls seeking remembrance. The weight of stories untold, lives unrecorded, love and loss that soaked into the very stones. If you ever visit St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, please remember, these weren't just bodies laid to rest. They were people with stories worth telling, lives worth remembering. And maybe if you listen closely enough in the fading light of day, you might hear their whispers asking you to carry their memories back to the world of the living. They warned Detective Samuel Hutchins about Union Cemetery even before he took the job. On his first morning in Easton, the older officers snickered as they poured their coffee, jostling for an unobstructed view of the man from the city who thought a small-town police force would mean quiet finishes. You'll be making house calls on raccoons after midnight if you're lucky, the sergeant said. But sooner or later you'll pull an all-nighter at Union. That place does not like to be ignored. Samuel brushed off the tales at first. He was in his 40s with a salt and pepper beard and a thick New England accent. He had worked too many years in Bridgeport's violent crime unit to buy into white lady tales and whispers of vengeful spirits. He clung to routine, interviews, evidence bags, chain of command. Yet Union Cemetery had its own hold on the town, a reputation built from missing time and sudden chills, from bad luck wrecks on Stepney Road, from things that happened between the headstones at night that nobody wanted to name. The file landed on his desk in October, 100-year-old pages worn thin at the folds. Disappearances, unsolved deaths, ritual vandalism, marked by the signature crimson blooms of wild ivy, wound through the ornate iron fence that ringed the grounds. Initial crime scene, October 5th. That morning, Samuel was summoned by a frantic call from an elderly groundskeeper. Ivy's red, blood red, all up the Coleman family vault. Somebody's cut themselves, or worse, he arrived to find a strange, disturbing scene. Scarlet-stained vines encircled the Coleman crypt, twisting between the stone letters of beloved names. At their roots, the ground seemed freshly disturbed, though the cemetery had seen no burials in months. Despite the evidence of recent digging and something oddly sticky at the base of the stone, no bodies were found. Just a faded photograph of a young woman, on the back in painstaking cursive, "I'm sorry. Help me rest." Locals clustered along the gate watching Samuel work. They did not murmur or ask questions. He got the sense they feared the answer. "Bad luck runs in ivy season," the oldest among them finally muttered. "It grows darkest where blood has been spilled, and it never leaves until the wrongs are buried for good." That evening, Samuel began his report with unusual trepidation. Union Cemetery Case File 1079. October 5, 2018. Heavily disturbed soil at family crypt. Red-stained ivy. No sign of trespassers. Photograph of deceased placed with visible care. Possible vandalism? Locals extremely agitated. Recommend midnight patrol shifted to cemetery for next 2 weeks. Monitor for further disturbances. Midnight patrols. Field notes. Union Cemetery changed after sunset. The iron fence, ornate and rusting, seemed taller somehow, enclosing the headstones like stern, silent witnesses. Even the brisk October wind felt heavier, thick with the scent of wet moss and old perfume. His second night, Samuel heard footsteps moving lightly alongside the edge of the Coleman plot, where most stones were more than a century old. He called out, no response but a sudden coldness more gripping than the chill air. The patrol reports filled with similar occurrences, cameras glitching, batteries draining, radios bursting into static. Never did he catch sight of an actual trespasser, but twice he found red ivy newly coiled in the grass, winding toward other gravestones, always those with deaths marked unsolved. Samuel brought in local historian Marjorie Lane to interpret the photo left at the crypt. She pointed immediately to the style. A studio portrait from the 1940s, the subject a solemn young woman with a dark beauty, her features delicate, immortalized by the photographer's flash. "That's Evelyn Holt," Marjorie said. "She disappeared in 1947, never solved. Her mother always brought flowers, but never ivy. She feared it. The old families all do." "What happened to her?" Samuel pressed. "She was last seen leaving a Halloween dance." "They never found her body," the town whispered, sometimes loudly, about a spurned suitor or about the old curse. "There's always been a story of blood in the ivy at Union. Every few years when something ugly happens, the red vines come back. My grandmother said it started over 100 years ago, after a Civil War widow was denied burial for practicing witchcraft." Pattern. Cold cases and red ivy. With Marjorie's help, Samuel cross-referenced the crypt vandalism with decades worth of missing person and cold case files. He realized, shocked, that each time the red ivy bloomed out of season, someone in Easton had gone missing, or a body had been discovered in the woods nearby. Usually a Jane Doe never identified. He documented each instance, completing charts, marking patterns on a map. The cycle repeated, always with the same season of blood-streaked leaves, always circling back to graves holding unanswered questions. Deaths left in limbo, families never granted closure. One name kept reappearing, Cora Blake, a local girl vanished in 1978, whose mother had led candlelight vigils at her tomb for years. Her case was eerily similar to Evelyn Holt's. Even the town had whispered about their likeness, as if the curse chose its victims by resemblance or fate. Stranger evidence. Night 5. On the 5th midnight patrol, a thick fog rolled into the cemetery. Samuel's flashlight beam barely pierced the shroud. At the heart of the old graveyard, near the Coleman plot, his radio spat static, and then a distinct whispering voice called out, "Help me rest." He spun. The air tasted cold and coppery, and atop the crypt stood a figure, at first appearing translucent, then unnervingly solid. A young woman, bruise-like shadows under her eyes, an old-fashioned dress stained at the hem. She looked at Samuel and uttered, "You see me, do not before flickering out like a dying bulb. The only trace she left was a single lock of auburn hair resting atop the photograph in his evidence bag. He collected it, fighting the surreal sense of death and time folding onto itself. Consultation. After-action memo. Samuel wrote up the encounter as unusual but left out the apparition, citing only possible prankster in period costume. Internally, doubt gnawed at him until his next meeting with Marjorie. "It's her," she insisted, voice trembling. "That's Evelyn's hair. Or Cora's. Or the White Lady. They're all the same. When the dead do not rest in union, they beg for justice. The red ivy grows to mark their suffering. This cemetery holds more secrets than bones." He asked her about the curse Marjorie described, generations of blame laid at the feet of an old feud. Two families at war, resolved in a long-ago murder never forgiven by the town and certainly not by the victims. The legend said the cemetery would remain restless until all wrongs were confessed and remembered. A breakthrough. The confession. Reluctantly, Samuel reopened old files. The Blevins family, whose patriarch was once a respected judge, had blocked town attempts to exhume a suspicious grave placed outside family boundaries, a Jane Doe interred in 1948 with no official ceremony. Samuel visited the grave marked only MB 1948 and noticed new ivy growing at the base. He contacted a forensic anthropologist in New Haven and, after a week of paperwork and local outrage, secured an order to exhume. Inside the tiny burial, they discovered a skeleton, a blood-stained ribbon and pieces of glass, consistent with a broken camera flashbulb from the 1940s. Marjorie wept when she saw the evidence. "That's Evelyn Holt. The hair, the ribbon, the camera. She was buried here without her name. DNA matched the last living Holt descendant." Samuel drafted his report in terse, clipped lines. Union Cemetery cold case closure. October 29th. Remains confirmed as Evelyn Holt. Family notified. Death ruled homicide. Investigation ongoing for original suspect. Red ivy receded from gravesite overnight. Evidence suggests ritual closure of long-standing pattern. Halloween night. Atonement and release. The town gathered at Union Cemetery under the cautious watch of the police. Marjorie led a candlelit procession among the tombs, reading out the names of those lost, restoring their stories to memory. Local clergy, standing side by side with agnostic townsfolk, read a blessing for each lost soul. Afterward, Detective Hutchins watched from near the Coleman crypt. The ground was still, the red ivy browning and curling away from the stone, returning to its normal green as the sun rose. The townspeople felt the shift. Neighbors spoke about better dreams, quieter nights, and children who stopped waking, shrieking from night terrors. A week later, Samuel was promoted to chief investigator, not for closing a case officially, but for restoring peace. After-action thoughts. Sam's private log. Samuel told no one about his last midnight round in Union Cemetery. Armed with a lantern, he walked the now peaceful paths. At the Coleman crypt, in fading moonlight, he heard the rustle of leaves. Just nature, he told himself. Yet as he passed the place where the red ivy had once crowned the stones, he caught sight of two silhouettes. Young women in old dresses standing side by side and holding hands. They gazed at him with gratitude, then faded into the mist. He left the photograph of Evelyn on her freshly marked grave with the words she'd written, "I'm sorry. Help me rest." And for the first time, a warm wind swept through Union Cemetery, bearing the scent of roses instead of blood and fear. Union's curse was never spoken of again, but in every October after, someone would spot a flicker of white moving under the maples, hear a voice on the wind, or find an old red bloom curling around a mossy gate. Reminders that forgotten wrongs can linger unless the living have the courage to name them. And so, Detective Hutchins' report closed not on a neat signed sentence but a warning, a nod to future generations. The blood in the ivy at Union Cemetery is not just a stain, it is a message from the silenced. Listen _. The static cut through the October air like fingernails on chalkboard, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing. Tasha Sinclair adjusted her headset and checked the battery indicator on her body cam for the third time in 10 minutes. The red recording light blinked steadily in the darkness, capturing every sound, every shadow, every moment of what would become the most disturbing investigation of her paranormal research career. Paranormal Investigation Unit 7, Westminster Hall Cemetery, Baltimore, Maryland, she whispered into her microphone. October 28th, 11:47 p.m. Temperature 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Present team members, myself, Jake Morrison, and David Chen. Behind her, Jake struggled with the infrared camera equipment, cursing under his breath as the tripod legs refused to lock properly on the uneven ground. David stood near the wrought iron fence, electromagnetic field detector in hand, watching the digital readout fluctuate wildly despite the absence of any electrical equipment in the vicinity. "This place is already lighting up like a Christmas tree," David muttered, tapping the EMF detector with his finger. "We're getting readings across the entire spectrum and we haven't even made it past the entrance yet." Westminster Hall and burying ground had been on their list for months. As paranormal investigators specializing in historical hauntings, the team knew the cemetery's reputation well. Dating back to 1786, it was the final resting place of Edgar Allan Poe, whose grave attracted thousands of visitors each year. But it was the other stories, the whispered legends passed down through generations of Baltimore residents, that had brought them here on this cold October night. The Screaming Skull. "Jake, you getting audio on this?" Tasha asked, adjusting her own equipment as they walked deeper into the cemetery. The ancient headstones rose around them like crooked teeth, some so weathered that the names and dates had been worn smooth by 2 centuries of Maryland weather. "Yeah, everything's recording, but Tash, I'm picking up something weird on the background audio. Listen to this." He rewound 30 seconds of footage and played it back through his headphones, then passed them to Tasha. Through the crackling static, she could hear their own voices, clear and distinct. But underneath, almost subliminal, was something else. A low rhythmic sound that might have been breathing or might have been something trying to speak. "Could be wind through the trees," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "What wind?" David asked, gesturing around them. The air was perfectly still, so quiet they could hear traffic from downtown Baltimore, several miles away. Even the usual night sounds of the city seemed muffled here, as if the cemetery existed in its own pocket of silence. They had done their research thoroughly before coming. The legend of Westminster's Screaming Skull dated back to the 1800s, when a minister named Reverend Samuel Morrison had been found murdered in the cemetery, his body brutally beaten and left among the graves. According to the stories, his skull had been separated from his body during the attack, and for weeks afterward, residents reported hearing screams emanating from the graveyard every night at exactly midnight. The screaming became so disruptive that city officials finally exhumed the minister's remains. They found his skull in a different location from the rest of his body, and local residents swore they could see it moving, jaw opening and closing as if trying to speak. In desperation, they gagged the skull and encased it in a concrete block, which was then placed beside the minister's reconstructed grave. "There," David said, pointing toward the older section of the cemetery. "That's got to be it." About 50 yards ahead, a crude concrete monument stood apart from the more elegant headstones surrounding it. Unlike the carved marble and granite memorials nearby, this was clearly a utilitarian structure, built for containment rather than commemoration. Even from a distance, it seemed to radiate an aura of wrongness that made Tasha's skin crawl. "Temperature just dropped 15 degrees, Jake announced, checking his digital thermometer. "We went from 62 to 47 in the space of about 10 steps." As they approached the concrete block, their equipment began malfunctioning in earnest. The EMF detector's needle shot to maximum and stayed there, while Jake's infrared camera started recording phantom heat signatures, human-shaped warm spots that appeared and disappeared faster than the eye could follow. "Look at this," Tasha said, kneeling beside the monument. The concrete was old and weather-stained, but carved into its surface were deep scratches that looked disturbingly like claw marks. These weren't made by animals. David circled the monument with his camera, documenting every angle. The scratches are definitely deliberate. Look at the pattern. They're concentrated around what would be the mouth area if this really does contain a skull. "Guys," Jake interrupted, his voice tense. "Check your audio levels." They all fell silent, listening. At first, there was nothing but the ambient city noise filtering through the cemetery. Then gradually they began to hear it. A low, muffled sound coming from somewhere near the concrete block. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing, but with an undertone of desperation that made it unmistakably human. "Is that—" Tasha began. "Shh." David held up a hand, motioning for complete silence. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was definitely coming from the direction of the monument, and it was definitely the sound of something trying to scream through a gag. The rhythm matched that of human speech, rapid, frantic, as if someone was trying desperately to communicate. 11:58, Jake whispered, checking his watch. 2 minutes to midnight. The muffled screaming intensified, becoming so loud that their recording equipment began picking up distortion. Tasha felt her heart hammering as she watched the needle on the EMF detector dance frantically across the entire spectrum. The temperature continued to drop, and their breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. "This is impossible," David said, but his voice shook. "The concrete is 3 inches thick. There's no way sound could carry through that, even if there was something inside." At exactly midnight, the screaming reached a crescendo that made all 3 investigators step back from the monument. The sound was no longer muffled. It was clear, piercing, unmistakably the cry of someone in agony. But more than that, it was trying to form words. "Help!" The voice screamed through what sounded like cloth or rope. "Help me! Find him! Make him pay!" Jake's camera captured it all, the audio, the temperature readings, the electromagnetic spikes. But more importantly, it captured something none of them saw with their naked eyes until they reviewed the footage later. At the moment of the loudest screaming, a translucent figure appeared beside the monument. A man in clerical clothing, his face a mask of rage and pain, pointing frantically toward the newer section of the cemetery. The screaming continued for exactly 3 minutes, then cut off abruptly. The temperature began to rise, their equipment readings returned to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over them lifted like a weight being removed from their shoulders. "Did you guys see?" Tasha started. "The figure?" "Yeah, I saw it," David said, his face pale. "Jake, please tell me the camera caught that." "Everything's recorded," Jake confirmed, though his hands were trembling as he checked the equipment. Temperature, audio, EMF readings, and whatever the hell that was we just witnessed. They spent another hour in the cemetery documenting everything they could, but the paranormal activity had ceased completely. It was as if the screaming had said everything it needed to say, and the spirit had returned to whatever dark corner of existence it normally occupied. Back at their research facility, they spent days analyzing the footage. The audio was clear and undeniable, the sound of a human voice screaming through a gag, forming recognizable words. The electromagnetic readings showed spikes that couldn't be explained by any natural phenomenon. And the thermal imaging had captured the unmistakable outline of a human figure that appeared and disappeared in perfect synchronization with the screaming. But it was David who made the most disturbing discovery. "I've been researching Reverend Morrison's murder," he told the team during their debriefing session. According to newspaper accounts from 1847, He was investigating financial irregularities in the church. He'd discovered that someone was embezzling money from the collection plates and using it to buy land around the cemetery for development. So he was killed to keep him quiet, Tasha said. That's what I thought. But here's the thing. The murder was never solved. The prime suspect was Morrison's assistant, a man named Jonathan Blackwood, but he had an alibi. He was supposedly visiting his sick mother in Philadelphia the night of the murder. David pulled out a manila folder filled with photocopied newspaper clippings and cemetery records. But I kept digging and I found something interesting. 3 months after Morrison's murder, Blackwood suddenly had enough money to buy a large plot in the newer section of Westminster Cemetery. He built an elaborate mausoleum for himself and his family, even though he was only 35 years old and in perfect health. You think the figure was pointing toward Blackwood's grave? Jake said. I think Reverend Morrison is still trying to identify his killer, David replied. And I think Jonathan Blackwood got away with murder for almost 200 years. They returned to Westminster Cemetery the following month, this time focusing their investigation on the Blackwood Mausoleum. What they found there would become the subject of their most controversial research paper. Evidence that seemed to suggest the paranormal activity at Westminster wasn't random haunting, but a systematic attempt by the dead to seek justice for unresolved crimes. The screaming skull continued to wail every night at midnight, but now Tasha understood it wasn't screaming in pain. It was screaming for justice, demanding that the truth finally be heard after nearly 2 centuries of silence. And sometimes late at night when the city grew quiet, Baltimore residents still reported hearing those muffled cries echoing from Westminster Cemetery, the voice of a murdered minister who refused to rest until his killer's name was finally spoken aloud. They say the dying see things the living cannot. In my 87 years walking this earth, I never believed such foolishness until Dr. Harrison told me the tumors in my lungs had spread to my spine, my liver, my brain. 3 months, maybe 4 if I was lucky. Time enough to set affairs in order, he said, to say goodbyes. But some goodbyes cannot be spoken to the living. My name is Walter Pennington, Walt to those who knew me before my hair went white and my back bent double. I was born in Knoxville in 1937, raised in the shadow of the Smoky Mountains by a grandmother who claimed she could speak to spirits and a grandfather who dismissed such notions as mountain superstition. I spent my childhood caught between their competing truths, never knowing which to believe until the night I first saw the Watcher. I was 8 years old, walking through Old Gray Cemetery on a dare from Tommy Morrison and his gang of bullies. The Victorian graveyard sprawled across 45 acres of hills and hollows in East Knoxville, its elaborate monuments and weathered headstones creating a maze of shadows in the moonlight. The older boys had bet me a silver dollar I wouldn't spend an hour alone among the graves after midnight. My family needed that dollar. Times were hard in 1945, and my father had not returned from the war. I entered through the main gate on Broadway, clutching a pocket watch my grandmother had given me. The cemetery felt different at night, alive with whispers I could not quite hear and movement I could not quite see. Every statue seemed to turn its head as I passed. Every rustling leaf sounded like footsteps on gravel paths. I had made it halfway through my hour when I saw him. He stood beside the Wilder family mausoleum, a figure in clothes that seemed to shimmer between shadow and substance. Tall and gaunt, wearing a long coat that hung from his shoulders like funeral drapes. His face was pale and sharp-featured, with hollow eyes that reflected the moonlight like pools of still water. He was watching me with an expression of profound sadness, as if my presence in that place brought him great pain. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I was certain he could hear it. But instead of approaching or speaking, he simply raised one skeletal hand and pointed toward the cemetery's older section, where the headstones dated back to the 1800s. Then, without a sound, he melted back into the shadows between the tombs. I ran from Old Gray that night, never claiming my silver dollar, never speaking of what I had seen. But as I grew older, I found myself drawn back to the cemetery again and again. During my teenage years, I would walk the winding paths on Sunday afternoons, ostensibly visiting the grave of a distant relative, but really searching for another glimpse of the figure I had come to think of as the Watcher. He appeared to me 7 more times over the decades, always in the same place beside the Wilder Mausoleum, always pointing toward the older graves with that same expression of inexplicable sorrow. In 1952, the night before I shipped out for Korea. In 1958, when I returned home to bury my grandmother. In 1963, the week I married my beloved Sarah. In 1971, on the day our son Michael was born. In 1984, when Sarah's cancer finally claimed her. In 1997, at Michael's funeral after the car accident that took him far too young. And most recently, just 6 months ago, on the night I first felt the sharp pain in my chest that would lead to Dr. Harrison's grim diagnosis. Each time I saw the Watcher, something significant happened in my life within days. A departure, a return, a beginning, an ending. He appeared at the threshold moments, the times when one phase of existence gave way to another. I came to understand that he was not trying to frighten me, but to prepare me, to mark the passages that shape a human life. Now, as October rain drums against the windows of my small house on Magnolia Avenue, I know why he has haunted my steps for nearly 80 years. I know where he was pointing all those times, and I know what he was trying to tell me. The older section of Old Gray Cemetery, established in 1850, contains graves that predate the Great Yellow Fever epidemic of 1854. Hundreds died that summer as the disease swept through Knoxville like a prairie fire, and the cemetery expanded rapidly to accommodate the dead. New plots were laid out in neat rows, modern and efficient compared to the haphazard arrangement of the earlier graves. But in their haste to bury the fever victims, the cemetery planners made a terrible mistake. They built the new section directly over an older burial ground, a small family plot that had been forgotten by everyone except the spirits who dwelt there. The Pennington family plot, my family's plot. I discovered this truth 3 weeks ago while researching my genealogy, hoping to leave my descendants some record of their heritage. Hidden in the basement archives of the Knox County Library, I found a deed dated 1849. Jeremiah Pennington, my great-great-grandfather, had purchased a small parcel of land in what would later become Old Gray Cemetery. The deed described a family burial ground containing the graves of his parents, his wife, and 3 children who had died in infancy. When the yellow fever struck 5 years later, the overwhelmed cemetery authorities apparently lost track of the old family plots. They platted new graves directly over the Pennington burial ground, erecting elaborate Victorian monuments where simple stone markers had once stood. My ancestors were not moved or reinterred. They were simply built over, forgotten, their resting place defiled by the pressing needs of the living. The Watcher was not some random spirit haunting Old Gray Cemetery. He was Jeremiah Pennington, my great-great-grandfather, pointing toward his desecrated family graves and waiting 80 years for one of his descendants to understand his message. Tonight, armed with this knowledge and facing my own approaching end, I returned to Old Gray Cemetery one final time. The October night was cold and damp, with fog rolling off the Tennessee River and settling among the monuments like a burial shroud. I carried with me a bouquet of mountain laurel, Sarah's favorite flower, and a letter I had written to the cemetery authorities documenting my family's rightful claim to the disputed ground. I walked slowly through the familiar paths, my oxygen tank wheeling behind me on its small cart. The elaborate Victorian monuments loomed out of the mist like ships in a ghostly harbor. Angels with weathered faces gazed down at me with expressions of eternal sorrow. Obelisks and crosses reached toward the clouded sky like fingers of the dead grasping for heaven. The Wilder family mausoleum stood unchanged, its granite walls streaked with decades of rain and neglect. I positioned myself beside it and waited, knowing with absolute certainty that the Watcher would come. He materialized from the fog at 11:57, exactly as I remembered him from my childhood. Tall and gaunt in his old-fashioned coat, with hollow eyes that held depths of sadness no living person could fathom. But this time, when our eyes met, I saw recognition in his gaze, understanding, relief. "I know who you are," I whispered into the cold night air. "I know what you've been trying to tell me all these years." Jeremiah Pennington, the Watcher, the shadow that had followed me through 8 decades of life, smiled for the first time. It transformed his gaunt features, making him appear almost human despite his translucent form. He nodded once, slowly, then beckoned for me to follow. Together we walked toward the older section of the cemetery. My steps were labored, my breathing shallow, but I forced myself to keep pace with the spirit of my ancestor. He led me to a cluster of elaborate Victorian graves, monuments to families whose names meant nothing to me now, but who had been buried atop the bones of my people. The Watcher stopped beside a particularly ornate memorial, a marble angel with outstretched wings that had been erected in 1855. He knelt beside the monument and placed his spectral hand against the earth at its base. "Here," he said, his voice like wind through autumn leaves. "They are here. All of them, waiting to be remembered." I knelt beside him, my aged joints protesting, and placed the mountain laurel on the ground where he indicated. As I did, I felt them, a stirring in the earth beneath my palms, the presence of souls who had been forgotten for more than a century and a half. "I'll make this right," I promised, pulling out the letter I had written to the cemetery authorities. "They'll know the truth. Your family will be remembered." Jeremiah Pennington rose to his full height and looked down at me with an expression of profound gratitude. The weight of sorrow that had defined his existence for so many years was lifting from his shoulders like fog before the morning sun. "Thank you," he whispered, and in his voice I heard not just his gratitude but that of all the forgotten dead, all the souls whose resting places had been lost to time and human oversight. As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern hills, the Watcher began to fade. His form became less substantial with each passing moment, his features blurring into the morning mist. But before he disappeared entirely, he raised his hand one final time, not pointing now, but waving farewell. I sat by that unmarked grave until full daylight, breathing in the autumn air and feeling the pain in my chest ease for the first time in months. The Watcher was gone, his vigil finally ended. The weight of his unfinished business had passed to me, but I carried it gladly. I had 3 months to live, maybe 4, and I would use every day to ensure that Jeremiah Pennington and his forgotten family received the recognition they deserved. They found me there the next morning, slumped peacefully against the marble angel, the letter clutched in my lifeless hands. The cemetery groundskeeper said later that my face bore the most serene expression he had ever seen on a dead man, as if I had finally found the peace that had eluded me in life. Old Gray Cemetery is quieter now. Visitors no longer report seeing a gaunt figure watching from the shadows, and the oppressive atmosphere that once clung to the older section has lifted like a curse finally broken. The Pennington family graves have been properly marked and maintained, their story added to the cemetery's official records. But sometimes, on foggy October nights when the veil between worlds grows thin, groundskeepers claim to see 2 figures walking together among the monuments. An old man with a wheeled oxygen tank and a tall figure in an antique coat, no longer separate by death but united in the completion of a task that spanned nearly a century. The Watcher's vigil is ended, but the love that bound him to his family and to me endures beyond the grave. The first time Marissa Caldwell saw the little girl in black, she was pushing her twin daughters on the swings at Greenwood Memorial Park in Riverside, California. It was a crisp Saturday morning in October, the kind of perfect Southern California day that makes you forget the summer heat and appreciate the gentle warmth of autumn sunshine. Emma and Sophie, both 6 years old, squealed with delight as their swings carried them higher into the cloudless blue sky. That's when Marissa noticed her standing at the edge of the playground watching. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, dressed in a formal black dress that seemed oddly old-fashioned, like something from a vintage photograph. The dress had puffy sleeves and a high neckline, with rows of tiny buttons marching up the front like dark pearls. Her long dark hair was parted severely down the middle and tied back with a black ribbon. But it was her stillness that caught Marissa's attention. She stood perfectly motionless, her pale hands folded in front of her, watching the twins with an expression of profound longing. "Mommy, who's that girl?" Emma asked, pointing toward the strange figure. Marissa looked again, but the child was gone. The edge of the playground was empty except for a maintenance worker trimming hedges near the cemetery gates. "What girl, honey?" Marissa asked, slowing Emma's swing. "The sad girl in the black dress. She was watching us." Sophie nodded vigorously from her own swing. She looked like she wanted to play, but she seemed scared to come over. Marissa scanned the playground again. A few other families were enjoying the morning, parents pushing toddlers on swings, older children racing down slides. But she saw no child in black anywhere. "I don't see anyone, girls." Maybe it was just shadows from the trees. But as they walked back to their car, parked along the service road that separated the playground from Greenwood Cemetery, Marissa found herself glancing over her shoulder. The cemetery stretched across 50 acres of gently rolling hills, dotted with oak trees and filled with headstones dating back to the early 1900s. Many of the older graves belonged to children, victims of diseases that modern medicine had long since conquered. It wasn't until their third visit to the playground that Marissa saw the child herself. She was sitting on a bench near the back fence, the one that offered a clear view of both the playground and the older section of the cemetery beyond. Emma and Sophie were playing on the jungle gym with 2 other children they'd met, their laughter carrying across the warm afternoon air. Marissa was reading a book, occasionally glancing up to check on the girls when movement caught her eye. The child in black sat on a weathered stone bench about 30 yards away, positioned so she could watch the playground through the chain-link fence. She was older than Marissa had initially thought, perhaps 10 or 11, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent in the dappled sunlight filtering through the oak branches. Her black dress was even more elaborate than Marissa remembered, with intricate beadwork around the collar and cuffs. But it was the child's expression that made Marissa's breath catch in her throat. The longing was so intense it was almost physical, as if she were pressing her face against glass, desperate to join the other children but unable to cross some invisible barrier. Marissa stood up, intending to walk over and perhaps invite the child to join her daughters at play. But as soon as she took a step forward, the girl looked directly at her. Their eyes met across the distance, and Marissa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October breeze. The child's eyes were dark and fathomless, filled with a sadness that no child should ever have to carry. For a moment that felt like hours, they stared at each other. Then the girl slowly shook her head as if warning Marissa away, and simply faded like morning mist. Not vanished, faded, becoming more and more transparent until only the empty bench remained. That evening, Marissa called the Riverside County Parks Department to ask about the cemetery next to the playground. The woman who answered the phone was helpful but seemed puzzled by Marissa's questions about children's graves in the older section. "Greenwood's been serving the community since 1908, she explained. "There are thousands of graves there, including quite a few children from the early days when childhood diseases were more common. Is there a specific grave you're looking for?" A family member, perhaps? No, I was just curious about the history of the area. Has anyone ever reported strange occurrences at the playground? Children seeing things that aren't there? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Well, that's an odd question, but now that you mention it, we do get occasional reports from parents about their kids talking to imaginary friends while playing there. Usually children claiming to see other kids who want to play but never actually join in. The playground's been there since the late 70s, and the reports have been fairly consistent over the years. Marissa felt her stomach tighten. What kind of reports? Oh, nothing harmful. Just children asking their parents about the shy girl or the sad boy they saw watching from near the cemetery fence. Kids have active imaginations, especially in a setting like that. The proximity to the cemetery probably makes them think about ghosts and such. Have any parents actually seen these children? Another pause. Not that I'm aware of. It's always secondhand through the children. But Marissa had seen her. Clear as day, solid as any living person until that final moment when she faded away like a photograph left too long in the sun. Over the next few weeks, the sightings became more frequent. Sometimes the child in black would be sitting on the bench watching the playground with that heartbreaking expression of longing. Other times she would be standing near the fence, her fingers wrapped around the chain links as if she were imprisoned behind them. Once Marissa saw her walking slowly along the cemetery's border, always staying in the shadow of the trees, always watching the playing children with those dark, sad eyes. Emma and Sophie seemed to sense her presence too, though they never mentioned seeing her again after that first day. But they began asking questions that made Marissa uncomfortable. "Mommy, why can't some children play with other children?" Emma asked one afternoon as they drove home from the playground. "What do you mean, sweetheart? Some children have to stay by themselves all the time. That's not fair." Sophie nodded solemnly from her car seat. "The sad girl wants to play with us, but something won't let her. She has to stay on the other side." "What other side?" Marissa asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. "The quiet side," Sophie said matter-of-factly, "where the sleeping people are." That evening, Marissa drove back to Greenwood Cemetery alone. She parked outside the main gates and walked through the entrance, past the newer sections with their neat rows of modern headstones toward the older area that bordered the playground. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made the weathered marble monuments glow like candles. Marissa walked slowly through the older section, reading names and dates, noting how many of the graves belonged to children who had died more than a century ago. She found what she was looking for near a cluster of oak trees that provided a perfect view of the playground beyond the fence. A small headstone, simple and unadorned compared to the elaborate monuments nearby. The inscription was worn but still readable. Helena Rose Blackwood. Beloved daughter, 1902 to 1912. She loved to watch the children play. Below the epitaph was a carving of a little girl in a formal dress, her hair pulled back with a ribbon, her hands folded primly in front of her. Even rendered in weathered stone, the resemblance to the child Marissa had been seeing was unmistakable. A small American flag had been placed next to the headstone, along with a bouquet of black roses that looked fresh despite the October heat. A brass plaque near the base of the stone provided additional information. Helena Rose Blackwood died of consumption in 1912 at the age of 10. According to family records, she spent her final months bedridden in the family home, watching other children play in the garden below her window. Her greatest wish was to join them, but her illness prevented her from leaving her room. She was buried in this spot specifically because it offered a view of the area where local children gathered to play. Marissa knelt beside the grave and placed her hand on the cool stone. As she did, she felt a presence beside her, not threatening, but achingly sad. "Hello, Helena," she whispered. The air around her seemed to shimmer, and for just a moment she saw the child in black standing next to the headstone. But this time, instead of longing, Helena's expression showed gratitude. She smiled, a radiant expression that transformed her pale features, and nodded once before fading away. The next day, Marissa brought Emma and Sophie to the playground as usual. But this time, she also brought something extra, a small bouquet of white flowers and a handwritten note. While the girls played, she walked to the cemetery fence and placed the flowers near the spot where she had so often seen Helena watching. The note was simple. For Helena Rose Blackwood. You are remembered. You are not alone. As they prepared to leave that afternoon, Emma tugged on Marissa's sleeve. Mommy, the sad girl isn't sad anymore. What do you mean, honey? She's smiling now, and she waved goodbye. Marissa looked toward the cemetery but saw only sunlight filtering through the oak trees and the gentle movement of branches in the autumn breeze. But somehow she knew that Helena Rose Blackwood's long vigil was finally over. After more than a century of watching from the shadows, she had been seen, acknowledged, and remembered. The child in black was no longer alone. Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the mist-shrouded peaks and ancient hollows of the Appalachian wilderness with 8 disturbing accounts that will forever change how you view America's most legendary trail. In this episode, we will descend into the heart of these primordial mountains with harrowing tales of disappearances, supernatural encounters, and the primal terror that stalks those who dare to walk alone among these ancient ridges. Each narrative has been meticulously documented from the first-hand testimonies of hikers, rangers, and survivors who emerged from these mountains forever changed by what they witnessed in the deep woods. These are not campfire stories or urban legends, but authentic experiences shared by individuals whose lives were shattered by encounters with forces that defy explanation along the most remote sections of the trail. To safeguard the identities of those brave enough to come forward, certain names and identifying details have been carefully altered while preserving the chilling truth of their experiences. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for the most authentic and disturbing true horror content that explores the darkest corners of our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unearth another collection of buried secrets that demand to be told. And after you listen to these accounts, share your own Appalachian Trail experiences in the comments below, because we know many of you have encountered things on these mountains that you have never spoken about. My name is Ella, and I have been documenting wildlife behavior along hiking trails for the past 8 years as part of my work with the National Wildlife Federation. I thought I had seen every kind of animal behavior these mountains could produce, from the curious to the aggressive to the simply bizarre. What I witnessed last November on a remote section of the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina changed my understanding of how nature communicates with those who know how to listen. I was conducting a 3-day survey of bird migration patterns along a stretch of trail that runs through the Nantahala National Forest. This particular section sees very few hikers during late fall, making it perfect for observing wildlife without human interference. The area is known for its diverse ecosystem and the massive old-growth trees that tower over the narrow trail like ancient sentinels watching over secrets they have kept for centuries. On the morning of my second day, I was setting up my camera equipment at a scenic overlook when I noticed something unusual in the valley below. There was a small clearing about half a mile off the main trail where someone had obviously made camp recently. I could see the bright colors of modern camping gear scattered around the site, which struck me as odd because the area was not accessible by any marked trail that I knew of. Through my telephoto lens, I could make out what appeared to be a high-end tent, still fully erected along with camping chairs, a portable table, and other expensive-looking equipment. But there was no movement around the campsite, no sign of the people who should have been using all that gear. Something about the scene felt wrong, like stumbling across a movie set that had been abandoned in the middle of filming. What made the discovery even more unsettling was the behavior of the local wildlife. Ravens had gathered in unusual numbers around the campsite, at least 30 or 40 birds perched in the trees surrounding the clearing. They were not behaving like scavengers looking for food scraps, but rather like sentries maintaining watch over something important. Every few minutes, several of them would take flight and circle the campsite in a coordinated pattern before returning to their perches. I had studied raven behavior extensively during my career, and this was unlike anything I had ever observed. Ravens are highly intelligent birds with complex social structures, but they do not typically gather in large groups around human campsites unless there is something specific attracting them. Their behavior suggested they were guarding something or trying to communicate information about the site below. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I packed my camera and basic supplies, leaving my heavier research equipment at the overlook, and began the challenging descent into the valley. There was no established trail leading to the clearing, so I had to pick my way carefully, through dense undergrowth and over fallen logs, following what appeared to be an animal path that wound between the massive tree trunks. The ravens watched my progress with obvious intelligence, some of them flying ahead of me as if leading the way, while others remained behind as if ensuring I did not retreat. Their calls echoed through the forest in patterns that seemed almost conversational, as if they were discussing my approach and deciding whether I should be allowed to continue. As I got closer to the campsite, I began to notice other details that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The camping gear was indeed expensive and high quality, but it had been arranged in a way that suggested the occupants had left in a hurry. A camp chair was overturned and personal items were scattered around as if someone had been searching through them hastily. More disturbing was what I found when I examined the perimeter of the campsite. There were clear signs of a struggle in the soft earth around the tent. Boot prints were mixed with what looked like barefoot impressions, and the vegetation was trampled and broken in patterns that suggested someone had been dragged or had fallen repeatedly while trying to escape. I noticed that the ravens had fallen silent as I entered the clearing, watching me with an intensity that felt almost human in its focus. They seemed to be waiting for me to discover something specific, and their behavior made me increasingly certain that whatever had happened here was not a simple case of campers leaving their gear behind. Inside the tent, I found personal belongings that painted a picture of the missing occupants. There were 2 sleeping bags indicating a couple, along with identification cards that showed they were experienced hikers from Virginia who had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier. Their names were Michael and Sarah Chen, and according to their hiking permits, they had planned to spend 5 days on this section of trail. What I discovered next made me realize that the ravens were trying to warn me about something far more serious than abandoned camping equipment. Behind the tent, partially concealed by fallen branches that appeared to have been deliberately arranged, I found evidence that someone had been digging in the soft forest floor. The depression in the earth was roughly rectangular and about 6 feet long, the exact size and shape that would accommodate a human body. The soil that had been excavated was piled nearby, along with a small camping shovel that clearly belonged to the missing hikers. But the hole was empty, and the displaced earth had been scattered to make it less obvious to casual observation. I realized with growing horror that I was looking at a burial site that had been recently disturbed. Someone had buried something here, then returned later to dig it up and move it elsewhere. The ravens had been guarding this location, trying to draw attention to what had happened in this remote clearing where no one would normally think to look. As I photographed the scene with my camera, documenting the evidence for the authorities, I became aware that the forest around me had fallen completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, no sound of wind in the branches overhead. The unnatural quiet was broken only by the soft whisper of raven wings as more birds arrived to join the growing congregation watching me work. I was so focused on documenting the scene that I almost missed the sound of approaching footsteps. The ravens heard it first, erupting into harsh warning calls that echoed through the trees like alarm bells. Someone was making their way through the forest toward the clearing, moving with the confident stride of someone familiar with the terrain. The bird's agitation told me everything I needed to know about the approaching visitor. This was not a lost hiker or a park ranger responding to my presence. The ravens were reacting to someone they recognized as a threat, someone they had encountered before in this place of violence and concealment. I grabbed my camera and quickly moved to the edge of the clearing, finding concealment behind a large fallen tree that provided both cover and a clear view of the campsite. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the sound of branches being pushed aside and the occasional muttered curse as the person navigated the difficult terrain. When the figure finally emerged into the clearing, I understood why the ravens had been maintaining their vigil. The man was tall and heavily built, wearing camouflage clothing that was stained with what looked like dried blood. He carried a large backpack and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been to this location many times before. He went directly to the disturbed burial site and began examining the scattered earth with obvious frustration. It was clear that he had expected to find something there that was no longer present, and his anger at the discovery was evident in his movements and the low growls of annoyance that escaped his lips. The ravens watched him with obvious hatred, some of them diving at his head and forcing him to duck and swat at them with his hands. But he seemed accustomed to their harassment, as if this confrontation was a familiar routine that played out every time he visited this place. I realized that this man was almost certainly responsible for whatever had happened to Michael and Sarah Chen, and that he had returned to move evidence that would connect him to their disappearance. The ravens had been trying to prevent this by drawing attention to the site, hoping that someone would discover the truth before he could complete his cover-up. While he was distracted by the attacking birds, I managed to photograph him from multiple angles, capturing clear images of his face and distinctive clothing. But as I was adjusting my camera settings for better lighting, I accidentally knocked against the fallen tree I was hiding behind, causing a small branch to snap with a sharp crack. The sound carried clearly across the clearing, and the man's head snapped up immediately. His eyes scanned the forest around the campsite with the focused intensity of a predator searching for prey. The ravens fell silent, as if they too understood that my discovery had put me in mortal danger. I held perfectly still, hoping that my camouflaged position would keep me hidden. But the man began moving methodically around the perimeter of the clearing, searching for the source of the sound. He moved with the patient thoroughness of someone experienced in hunting human prey, checking behind every tree and fallen log large enough to conceal a person. As he got closer to my hiding spot, I made the decision to run. I burst from concealment and crashed through the forest in the direction I hoped would take me back to the main trail, branches whipping at my face and clothes as I pushed through the dense undergrowth at reckless speed. Behind me, I could hear him giving chase, his heavy footsteps pounding through the forest, accompanied by shouts of rage that echoed off the surrounding hills. But the ravens were not finished with their involvement in this deadly game. They launched themselves at my pursuer in coordinated attacks, diving at his head and face with their sharp talons extended, forcing him to slow down and defend himself. Their intervention gave me the precious seconds I needed to reach the animal path I had followed into the valley. I scrambled up the steep slope toward the main trail, my lungs burning and my heart pounding with terror and exertion. The ravens continued their assault on the man below, their harsh cries filling the forest with sounds of battle. When I finally reached the main trail, I ran until I found a group of other hikers who helped me contact the park rangers by satellite phone. Within hours, law enforcement officers were searching the area I had described, guided by my photographs and GPS coordinates. They found the disturbed campsite and the evidence of the burial site, along with other items that connected the location to several missing hikers over the past 2 years. but they never found the man I had encountered despite an extensive search of the area. The ravens had dispersed by the time the authorities arrived, their mission apparently complete. They had successfully drawn attention to the crimes committed in their territory and ensured that evidence was preserved for investigation. Michael and Sarah Chen were never found, but their disappearance is now part of an active investigation into a serial killer who targets remote hikers in the Appalachian wilderness. The case remains open and authorities believe he is still active in the region. I still conduct wildlife research along hiking trails, but I pay much more attention to animal behavior that seems unusual or out of place. I learned that day that ravens are not just intelligent birds, but guardians of the forest who will risk their own safety to protect the truth from being buried forever. The mountains keep many secrets, but sometimes the creatures that live there decide that certain secrets need to be revealed. My name is Jonathan, and I have been hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail for over a decade. I thought I knew these mountains well enough to handle anything they could throw at me. I was wrong. What happened to me last October on a remote stretch through the Shenandoah National Park changed everything I believed about being alone in the wilderness. I had planned a 5-day solo hike through one of the more isolated sections of the trail, starting at the Rockfish Gap entrance and heading north towards Swift Run Gap. The weather forecast looked perfect for late fall hiking, crisp mornings and cool afternoons with clear skies. I had done this exact route twice before, so I felt confident about the terrain and water sources. What I did not account for was the man who would turn those 5 days into the most terrifying experience of my life. The first day went exactly as planned. I made good time on the familiar trail, stopping at my usual spots for water and rest. The autumn colors were at their peak, painting the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. I reached my planned campsite at High Top Hut just as the sun was setting behind the western ridges. The shelter was empty, which was not unusual for this time of year on a weekday. I set up my tent nearby and prepared a simple dinner, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the forest settling into night. It was the next morning when I first saw him. I was breaking camp around sunrise when I noticed a figure standing on the trail about 50 yards south of where I had camped. He appeared to be another hiker, wearing a dark jacket and carrying what looked like a large backpack. I waved in the friendly manner that trail hikers use to greet each other, but he did not wave back. Instead, he just stood there watching me pack up my gear. Something about his stillness made me uneasy, but I dismissed it as early morning grogginess affecting my perception. I finished packing and headed north on the trail. When I looked back after about 10 minutes of hiking, the man was gone. I assumed he had continued south on his own journey and thought nothing more of it. The morning was beautiful, with low mist hanging in the valleys and the sun filtering through the canopy in golden shafts. I made good progress toward my next planned stop at Lewis Mountain. Around midday, I stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook that provided sweeping views of the valley below. While I was eating my trail mix and drinking water, I heard footsteps approaching on the trail behind me. I turned to see the same man from the morning, now much closer than before. He was middle-aged with graying hair and a weathered face that suggested he spent considerable time outdoors. His clothes were well worn but appropriate for hiking, and his backpack looked expensive and professional. He approached with what seemed like a friendly demeanor and asked if I was heading north on the trail. When I confirmed that I was, he smiled and said he was going the same direction. He introduced himself as Mark and asked about my planned route for the next few days. I found myself sharing more information than I normally would with a stranger, telling him about my planned campsites and daily mileage goals. Looking back, I realized this was my first real mistake. Mark seemed knowledgeable about the trail and the area, asking specific questions about water sources and trail conditions ahead. He mentioned that he had been hiking this section for years and knew all the best camping spots, including some unofficial sites that were not marked on the standard trail maps. His conversation felt natural and friendly, the kind of encounter that makes solo hiking more enjoyable. We hiked together for the rest of the afternoon, sharing stories about previous hiking adventures and discussing the best gear for different conditions. As evening approached, we reached the area where I had planned to camp for the night. Mark suggested an alternative site about half a mile off the main trail, claiming it had better water access and more protection from the wind. Against my better judgment, I agreed to check it out. The site was indeed beautiful, nestled in a small clearing beside a clear mountain stream. We set up our tents on opposite sides of the clearing and prepared dinner separately, though we continued talking across the distance. It was during dinner that Mark began asking more personal questions. He wanted to know where I lived, what I did for work, and whether anyone knew exactly where I was on the trail. He claimed he was just making conversation, but something about his tone made me uncomfortable. I gave vague answers and tried to change the subject, but he kept returning to questions about my personal life and hiking plans. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every small sound in the forest seemed amplified, and I found myself listening intently for any movement near my tent. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps moving around the perimeter of our campsite. They were slow and deliberate, not the random wandering of an animal looking for food. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, trying to determine if the sounds were coming from Mark moving around his campsite or something else entirely. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, sometimes coming close to my tent, sometimes moving toward the stream, but always maintaining that same careful, measured pace. I never heard Mark's voice or the sound of his tent zipper, which made me increasingly certain that he was not inside his tent where he should have been. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted and on edge. Mark was sitting by the cold remains of last night's fire when I emerged from my tent, looking as if he had been awake for hours. He greeted me cheerfully and asked how I had slept, showing no signs of fatigue despite what I was certain had been his nighttime wandering. I decided to pack up quickly and get back to the main trail, claiming I wanted to make an early start to cover more miles that day. As we hiked that morning, Mark began demonstrating knowledge about my hiking habits that he should not have possessed. He mentioned that I always stopped at the same overlook for lunch, that I preferred to camp near water sources, and that I typically hiked about 12 miles per day. When I asked how he knew these details, he laughed and said he was just good at reading people. But his answers felt rehearsed, and I began to suspect he had been watching me for longer than just the previous day. The situation became truly frightening when we stopped for a rest break around mid-morning. While I was drinking water and checking my map, Mark casually mentioned that I had set up my tent in exactly the same spot where I had camped on my previous hikes through this area. He described the specific tree I had tied my food bag to and the flat rock I had used as a table. Details that would be impossible to know unless he had been watching me on those earlier trips. When I confronted him about this knowledge, his friendly demeanor changed completely. His eyes became cold and calculating, and he smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. He told me that he had been following hikers on this section of trail for years, learning their patterns and habits. He said some hikers were more interesting than others, and that I had become one of his favorites to watch. I realized with growing horror that this man had been stalking me for years without my knowledge, probably during each of my previous hikes through this area. He knew my routines, my preferences, and my vulnerabilities. I was alone in the wilderness with someone who had been planning this encounter for a very long time. I told Mark that I needed to head back to the main trail immediately, but he blocked my path and suggested we continue hiking together to my planned campsite for that night. The way he said it made it clear that this was not really a suggestion. I agreed, hoping to find an opportunity to get away from him when we encountered other hikers or reached a more populated area of the trail. We hiked in tense silence for the next several hours. Mark stayed close behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing and the sound of his footsteps matching mine. Every time I tried to increase my pace, he matched it effortlessly. When I stopped to rest, he stopped too, always positioning himself between me and the direction we had come from. As afternoon turned to evening, I realized that we had not encountered a single other hiker all day, which was unusual even for this remote section of trail. Mark seemed to know exactly which routes would keep us away from other people, steering me toward lesser-used paths and alternate routes that bypassed the main camping areas. When we reached what he claimed was my planned campsite for the night, I discovered it was not anywhere near where I had intended to stop. We were in a small clearing completely surrounded by dense forest, with no visible trail markers and no sign that other hikers had ever used this location. The isolation was complete and terrifying. Mark began setting up his tent with practiced efficiency while suggesting I do the same. But instead of complying, I made the decision that probably saved my life. I told him I had forgotten something important back at our previous campsite and needed to retrace our route to find it. Before he could object, I dropped my heavy pack and ran. I crashed through the forest in the direction I thought would take me back to the main trail, branches tearing at my clothes and face as I pushed through the undergrowth. Behind me, I could hear Mark shouting and giving chase, his voice echoing through the trees with a rage that confirmed my worst fears about his intentions. I ran for what felt like hours, completely lost and panicked, until I finally stumbled onto a section of the main trail that I recognized. From there, I was able to navigate back to a road crossing where I flagged down a passing car and got a ride to the nearest town. At the local police station, I learned that Mark's real name was David Crawford, and he had been wanted in connection with several missing hikers in the region over the past 3 years. The authorities had been looking for him but had never been able to establish a pattern or predict where he would appear next. They found my abandoned pack at the campsite, along with detailed notes about my hiking habits and routes written in David's handwriting. There were also similar notes about other hikers, some of whom had been reported missing and never found. David Crawford was never caught. He disappeared back into the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, possibly still out there watching and following other unsuspecting hikers. I never returned to that section of trail, and I never hike alone anymore. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, remembering the sound of those careful footsteps circling my tent in the darkness. And I wonder how many other hikers he had watched and followed before he made his move. The mountains I once loved now feel like a hunting ground where predators wait patiently for the right moment to reveal themselves. That is why I am sharing this story. If you hike alone on remote sections of trail, trust your instincts when something feels wrong. The greatest dangers in the wilderness are not always the ones we prepare for. 3. My name is Ryan, and I have been solo camping in remote wilderness areas for over 15 years. I pride myself on being prepared for any situation these mountains can present, from sudden weather changes to dangerous wildlife encounters. But what happened to me last December near Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina taught me that some things in these ancient hills cannot be explained by logic or survival training. I had chosen a particularly challenging section of trail for my winter camping trip, a remote area that sees almost no foot traffic during the colder months. The isolation was exactly what I needed after a difficult year at work, and I was looking forward to several days of complete solitude among the snow-covered peaks. My planned campsite was located at a high-elevation clearing that offered spectacular views of the surrounding ridges during clear weather. The forecast had called for possible snow showers, but nothing that would prevent an experienced winter camper from enjoying a safe trip. I had packed all the necessary cold weather gear, including a 4-season tent rated for extreme conditions, and a sleeping bag designed for temperatures well below zero. My food supplies were calculated for 5 days with an extra day of emergency rations, and I carried multiple methods of fire starting and water purification. The hike to my chosen campsite took most of the day, with the trail becoming increasingly challenging as I gained elevation. The temperature dropped steadily as afternoon turned to evening, and by the time I reached the clearing where I planned to spend the night, a light snow had begun to fall. The flakes were small and dry, creating a peaceful atmosphere as they drifted through the bare branches of the surrounding trees. I set up my camp efficiently, taking advantage of the remaining daylight to establish a secure base for what I expected would be a cold but comfortable night. The clearing was sheltered on 3 sides by dense forest, with the 4th side opening onto a dramatic view of the valley far below. I positioned my tent to take advantage of the natural windbreak while maintaining access to the scenic overlook. As darkness fell, the snowfall intensified significantly. What had been a light dusting became a steady accumulation that began to muffle all sound from the surrounding forest. I prepared a hot dinner and settled into my tent for the evening, listening to the gentle whisper of snow against the fabric walls and feeling grateful for the warmth of my sleeping bag. It was around midnight when I first heard the voices calling through the storm. At first, I dismissed the sounds as wind moving through the trees, creating audio illusions that can trick the mind during long winter nights in isolated locations. But as I listened more carefully, the sounds began to resolve into what seemed like human voices shouting for help. Somewhere in the darkness beyond my campsite, the calls appeared to be coming from multiple directions, sometimes from the valley below, sometimes from the ridges above, and occasionally from the dense forest that surrounded my clearing on 3 sides. The voices sounded desperate and frightened, calling out words that were almost but not quite clear enough to understand through the muffling effect of the falling snow. My first instinct was to help whoever was in distress, but something about the situation made me hesitate. The voices seemed to be calling from locations that would be impossible for hikers to reach during a snowstorm, particularly in the middle of the night when visibility was essentially 0. The ridge lines they appeared to be coming from were accessible only by technical climbing routes that no sane person would attempt in these conditions. I unzipped my tent and listened more carefully to the pattern of the calls. They came in waves lasting for several minutes before fading away, then returning from a different direction with renewed intensity. The voices sounded like they belonged to different people, men and women of various ages, all calling for help with the same desperate urgency. But there was something fundamentally wrong with the acoustic properties of the sounds. They seemed to carry farther and clearer than should have been possible in the heavy snow, reaching my ears with a distinctness that defied the physical laws governing how sound travels through dense precipitation. The voices also lacked the breathless quality that would be expected from people struggling through deep snow in freezing temperatures. Despite my growing uneasiness about the situation, I could not ignore what might be genuine calls for help from lost or injured hikers. I dressed quickly in my warmest layers and grabbed my headlamp, GPS device, and emergency supplies. If there were people in trouble somewhere in the storm, I had a moral obligation to attempt a rescue even if the circumstances seemed strange. I left my tent and began moving in the direction of the most recent calls, which appeared to be coming from a ridgeline about half a mile northeast of my campsite. The snow was now falling heavily enough to limit visibility to just a few yards beyond my headlamp beam, and the accumulation was making travel increasingly difficult with each step. The voices continued to call as I struggled through the deepening snow, always seeming to come from just ahead of my current position. But no matter how far I traveled toward the sounds, they never seemed to get any closer. Instead, they maintained the same distance and clarity, as if the sources were moving away from me at exactly the same pace I was moving toward them. After what felt like an hour of difficult hiking through terrain that was becoming increasingly treacherous, I realized that I had traveled much farther from my campsite than I had intended. The GPS showed that I was now over a mile from my tent, having followed the voices up steep slopes and along narrow ridgelines that would be dangerous even in good weather conditions. The calls were still coming from ahead of me, but I was beginning to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. The voices never paused for breath, never showed signs of exhaustion despite calling continuously for hours, and never responded when I shouted back offering help and asking for their location. More disturbing was the realization that the voices were leading me along paths that would take me farther and farther from safety. Each time I tried to turn back toward my campsite, the calls would intensify from a different direction, creating an almost irresistible urge to continue following them deeper into the wilderness. I stopped at a small clearing and checked my GPS again, discovering that I was now dangerously close to an area marked on my map as containing steep cliffs and unstable rock formations. The voices were calling from just beyond the tree line ahead, in a direction that my map showed led directly to a series of dramatic drop-offs that would be invisible in the current weather conditions. With growing horror, I realized that the voices were not coming from people in distress, but were somehow intended to lure me toward the dangerous cliff area where a single misstep would result in a fatal fall. The pattern of the calls, always maintaining the same distance and always leading me in directions that took me away from safety, suggested a deliberate attempt to guide me into mortal danger. I turned off my headlamp and stood in complete darkness, listening to the voices continue their desperate pleas for help. Without the light to guide me, I could focus entirely on the acoustic properties of the sounds, and what I heard convinced me that these were not human voices at all. They had a hollow, echoing quality that suggested they were being produced by something that did not possess human vocal cords or respiratory systems. The voices also demonstrated knowledge of my position and movements that would be impossible for lost hikers to possess. They always called from locations that would draw me away from my campsite and toward increasingly dangerous terrain, adjusting their apparent positions based on my responses in ways that suggested intelligent coordination rather than random panic. As I stood motionless in the darkness, the voices began to change in character. The desperate calls for help gradually transformed into what sounded like attempts at conversation, with individual voices asking questions about my location and intentions. They wanted to know where I was camped, how long I planned to stay in the area, and whether anyone knew my exact route. The interrogation quality of these new vocalizations convinced me that I was dealing with something that was actively hunting me, using the universal human response to calls for help as a way to draw victims away from safety and into situations where they could be easily eliminated. The voices were mimicking human distress calls with the same predatory intelligence that allows certain animals to imitate the sounds made by their prey. I began moving as quietly as possible back toward my campsite, using my GPS to navigate in the darkness rather than risk using my headlamp to signal my position. The voices continued calling, but now they seemed frustrated and angry rather than desperate. They were calling my name, which I had never provided, and making increasingly specific references to my equipment and planned route. The journey back to my tent took nearly 2 hours, with me stopping frequently to check my GPS position and listen for changes in the pattern of the calls. The voices followed my retreat, always staying close enough to be heard but never close enough to be seen. They seemed to know exactly where I was despite my attempts at stealth, commenting on my progress and making threats disguised as offers of help. When I finally reached my campsite, I discovered that my tent had been disturbed during my absence. The guy lines had been loosened, causing the tent to sag and allowing snow to accumulate on the rainfly in patterns that would eventually cause structural failure. My food cache had been opened and scattered around the clearing, and my backup supplies had been removed from their protective containers and exposed to the storm. The damage was too systematic to be the result of curious wildlife, and too specifically targeted to be caused by random wind or snow accumulation. Something had deliberately sabotaged my camp while I was being led away by the voices, ensuring that I would return to find my shelter compromised and my supplies contaminated or destroyed. I spent the remainder of the night inside my partially collapsed tent, listening to the voices circle my campsite in the darkness. They no longer bothered with pretending to be human calls for help, instead producing sounds that seemed designed to create maximum psychological terror. The vocalizations included inhuman screams, mechanical grinding noises, and what sounded like recordings of previous victims pleading for their lives. At dawn, the voices finally stopped, and the snowstorm moved on to reveal clear skies and brilliant sunshine reflecting off the fresh accumulation. I packed my remaining gear as quickly as possible and began the hike back to the trailhead, abandoning my planned multi-day trip in favor of immediate escape from whatever had terrorized me through the night. During the descent, I discovered that the area around my campsite was marked with symbols carved into the bark of surrounding trees. The symbols appeared to be recent and were arranged in patterns that suggested some kind of territorial marking or warning system. Each symbol was accompanied by initials and dates going back several years, suggesting that other hikers had encountered similar experiences and felt compelled to leave evidence of their presence. I reported the incident to park authorities but was told that similar reports had been filed by other winter campers in the Grandfather Mountain area over the past decade. The official explanation was that extreme weather conditions and isolation can cause auditory hallucinations and paranoid behavior in solo hikers, leading to misinterpretation of natural sounds as threatening voices. But I know what I heard that night was not a hallucination. Something in those mountains uses human voices as bait to lure people away from safety and into situations where they disappear forever. The carved symbols I found suggest that some hikers have managed to survive their encounters, but others have not been so fortunate. I still go winter camping, but never alone, and never in areas where other hikers have reported hearing unexplained voices calling through the darkness. Some mountains hold secrets that are better left undiscovered. My name is Chloe, and I have always believed that the mountains hold memories of everyone who has ever walked their trails. What happened to me last spring on a section of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia proved that some of those memories refuse to stay buried in the past. I was completing a solo day hike on a lesser-known trail that connects to the main Appalachian Trail system through the Blue Ridge Mountains. The route is popular with local hikers but rarely sees visitors from outside the region, making it perfect for someone seeking solitude and quiet contemplation. The morning had started clear and warm, with the kind of perfect spring weather that makes the mountains feel alive with new growth and possibility. About 3 miles into my hike, I encountered a section of trail where thick fog had settled in the valley, creating an ethereal atmosphere that transformed the familiar forest into something mysterious and otherworldly. The mist hung between the trees like curtains, limiting visibility to just a few yards in any direction and muffling all sounds except the soft drip of condensation from the branches overhead. It was while I was navigating through this fog that I first saw the woman. She appeared suddenly on the trail ahead of me, materializing out of the mist as if she had been walking there all along. At first glance, she appeared to be another hiker, but as I got closer, I noticed several details about her appearance that seemed out of place for a modern trail user. The woman was wearing a long dress that appeared to be made of dark wool or similar heavy fabric. The dress reached almost to her ankles and had long sleeves with fitted cuffs that were typical of clothing from a much earlier era. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate upswept style that would have been fashionable in the late 1800s, and she wore what looked like leather boots that laced up to mid-calf height. Despite the unusual clothing, the woman appeared to be in distress. She was walking slowly and seemed disoriented, frequently stopping to look around as if searching for something or someone. Her movements had the quality of someone who was lost and becoming increasingly desperate to find her way. As I approached her, I called out a greeting and asked if she needed help. The woman turned toward me with obvious relief and began speaking in a voice that carried a slight accent I could not immediately identify. She told me that she was looking for her children, who had wandered off while they were picking berries in the woods near their home. She explained that she had been searching for them since early morning and was becoming frightened that something terrible had happened to them. The woman described her children in detail, a boy named Thomas who was 8 years old and a girl named Mary who was 6, both wearing clothes that would have been typical for rural children in the 19th century. What struck me as odd about her story was that she seemed to believe we were much closer to settled areas than we actually were. She kept referring to nearby farms and a local schoolhouse that should have been within walking distance, but I knew from my map that we were miles from any permanent structures or residential areas. I gently explained to her that we were in a designated wilderness area where no one lived permanently, and that the nearest town was over 10 miles away, by road. But rather than accepting this information, she became increasingly agitated and insisted that her home was just beyond the next ridge, in a valley where her husband was waiting for her to return with the children. The woman began walking again, moving with determined purpose in a direction that led away from the main trail and toward increasingly rough terrain. She seemed to know exactly where she was going despite the heavy fog that made navigation nearly impossible. I followed her, partly out of concern for her safety and partly out of curiosity about how she had ended up in this remote location dressed in period clothing. As we walked, she continued to describe her search for the missing children, providing details about their personalities and habits that painted a vivid picture of a loving mother's desperate concern. She told me about Thomas's fascination with small animals and how he often lingered behind the family when they went berry picking because he stopped to examine every interesting insect or bird he encountered. She described Mary as a cautious child who rarely strayed far from her mother's side, making it unusual for her to have wandered off without permission. The woman theorized that Thomas had discovered something particularly interesting, and that Mary had followed him to see what had captured his attention. Her descriptions were so detailed and emotionally authentic that I found myself becoming invested in the search for these children, despite growing evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire situation. The fog seemed to be getting thicker as we moved deeper into the wilderness, and the temperature was dropping in a way that felt unnatural for the time of day and season. We had been walking for what felt like an hour when the woman suddenly stopped and pointed ahead into the mist. She claimed she could see her house in the distance, describing a 2-story wooden structure with a stone chimney and a large garden where she grew vegetables for her family. But when I looked in the direction she was indicating, I could see nothing but more forest disappearing into the fog. The woman began calling out to her children by name, her voice carrying a desperate urgency that made my heart ache with sympathy. She called for Thomas and Mary, repeatedly pausing between calls to listen for any response, but the only sounds that came back were the echo of her own voice and the continued dripping of moisture from the trees around us. It was then that I noticed something that made me question everything about this encounter. Despite the heavy fog and the fact that we had been walking for over an hour through difficult terrain, the woman showed no signs of physical exertion. She was not breathing heavily. Her clothing showed no signs of moisture from the damp air, and her elaborate hairstyle remained perfectly arranged despite the humidity and our movement through dense undergrowth. More disturbing was the realization that I had not seen any footprints behind her as we walked, even though the soft forest floor should have clearly shown the impressions left by her heavy boots. My own footprints were clearly visible in the damp earth, but there was no evidence that she was actually making physical contact with the ground as she moved. I stopped walking and watched her more carefully, trying to understand what I was actually witnessing. The woman continued moving ahead of me, still calling for her children, but her movements had a floating quality that suggested she was not entirely bound by the same physical laws that governed my own motion through the forest. When I called out to her, asking her to wait for me, she turned back with an expression of confusion and sadness that seemed to look right through me. She asked if I had seen her children, but when I tried to explain my growing concerns about our situation, she did not seem to hear my words. Instead, she resumed her search with renewed determination, moving deeper into the wilderness. I made the decision to stop following her and instead began trying to navigate back to the main trail using my GPS device. But when I checked the screen, I discovered that it was showing my location as several miles from where I believed we had been walking, in an area that my map indicated was largely inaccessible due to steep terrain and dense vegetation. As I stood trying to understand how I had become so disoriented, the fog began to clear slightly, and I realized that the woman had disappeared. One moment she had been visible just ahead of me, and the next moment she was gone, as if she had never been there at all. Her voice could no longer be heard calling for the children, and the forest had returned to its normal quiet morning atmosphere. I eventually found my way back to the main trail and completed my hike without further incident. But the encounter left me with questions that demanded answers, so I began researching the history of the area where I had met the mysterious woman. What I discovered in local historical records was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. In 1873, a woman named Catherine Mitchell had lived with her family in a valley that was later flooded to create a reservoir for a nearby town. According to newspaper accounts from that time, Catherine had taken her two young children, Thomas and Mary Barry, picking in the woods near their home on a foggy spring morning. The children had wandered away from their mother and become lost in the dense forest. Catherine spent days searching for them, refusing to give up hope even as the local community organized search parties to help look for the missing children. Neither the children nor Catherine were ever found, and the case remained one of the region's most enduring mysteries. The historical accounts described Catherine as a devoted mother who was known for her distinctive style of dress and elaborate hairstyles that reflected her upbringing in a prosperous family before her marriage to a local farmer. I believe that I encountered Catherine Mitchell that morning in the fog, still searching for her children after more than 150 years. Unable to accept that they are beyond her reach, the mountains keep their memories alive, and some losses are too profound to be healed by the passage of time. The fog still settles in that valley on spring mornings, and sometimes hikers report hearing a woman's voice calling for Thomas and Mary in the mist. My name is Anthony, and I have been an experienced backpacker for 20 years. I thought I knew everything about navigation, survival, and the psychological challenges of solo wilderness travel. Last August, I attempted what should have been a simple 5-day section hike through the George Washington National Forest in Virginia. What happened to me during those 14 days changed my understanding of how the mountains can trap a person in ways that defy logic and explanation. I had planned a straightforward route covering approximately 60 miles of the Appalachian Trail, starting at Rockfish Gap and ending at Swift Run Gap. The section was familiar to me from previous hikes, and I carried detailed topographic maps, a GPS device, and a compass as backup navigation tools. My food supplies were calculated for 6 days, with an additional day of emergency rations, more than enough for the planned duration of the trip. The first day went exactly as expected. I made good time on the well-marked trail, stopped at familiar landmarks, and reached my planned campsite at the scheduled time. The weather was perfect for hiking, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures that made the journey enjoyable rather than challenging. I set up camp confident that I would complete the route without any significant difficulties. On the second morning, I began to notice subtle signs that something was wrong with my navigation. Trail markers that I remembered from previous hikes seemed to be in slightly different positions, and familiar landmarks appeared to have changed in small but noticeable ways. A distinctive rock formation that should have been on my left was now on my right, and a stream crossing that I remembered being shallow was now deep enough to require careful wading. I dismissed these discrepancies as failures of memory, assuming that my recollections from previous hikes were less accurate than I had believed. The GPS continued to show my position on the planned route, and the compass readings were consistent with my expected direction of travel. There was no reason to suspect that anything was fundamentally wrong with my navigation. By the third day, the inconsistencies had become impossible to ignore. I was encountering sections of trail that I was certain I had never seen before, despite having hiked this route multiple times over the past decade. The terrain was similar to what I expected, but the specific details were wrong in ways that suggested I was somehow following a parallel path through unfamiliar territory. More disturbing was the realization that I had not encountered a single other hiker since beginning the trip. The section of trail I was supposedly following normally sees moderate foot traffic, and I should have met at least a few other backpackers or day hikers during my first 3 days. The complete absence of other people began to feel unnatural and threatening. On the 4th day, I made a discovery that challenged my understanding of where I was and how long I had been hiking. I reached a campsite that I was certain I had used on my first night, complete with the distinctive fire ring and flat sleeping area where I remembered setting up my tent. But according to my GPS and the distance I had covered, I should have been 40 miles from that location. I searched the area carefully and found clear evidence of my previous occupation of the site. The remains of my campfire were exactly where I had left them, and I even found a small piece of gear that I remembered dropping during my first night. But the discovery made no sense given my understanding of my route and progress over the past 4 days. That night, I heard my own voice calling from somewhere in the darkness beyond my campsite. The voice was unmistakably mine, calling my name and asking for help in tones of increasing desperation. The sounds seemed to come from different directions, sometimes from the trail ahead, sometimes from the forest to either side, and occasionally from behind me in the direction I had come. I remained in my tent knowing that whatever was producing those sounds was not actually me, despite the perfect replication of my voice and speech patterns. The calling continued for hours, sometimes pleading for rescue, sometimes angrily demanding that I come out and explain why I was hiding. The voices knew details about my life that only I should know, referencing specific memories and experiences with accuracy that was both impressive and terrifying. By morning, I had consumed more food than I should have used during my first 4 days, despite the fact that my appetite had been normal and I had not been eating larger portions than usual. When I checked my supplies, I discovered that I had only 2 days of rations remaining, along with the emergency day I had packed as backup. The GPS continued to show my position as being on my planned route, but the displayed mileage indicated that I had covered nearly twice the distance that should have been possible given the terrain and my normal hiking pace. The device showed that I had been hiking for 7 days rather than 4, despite my clear memory of only 4 nights spent in the wilderness. I made the decision to abandon my planned route and head directly toward the nearest road, hoping to reach civilization before my food supplies were completely exhausted. But when I tried to navigate toward the highway that should have been only a few miles to the east, I found myself returning to the same landmarks repeatedly, as if I was walking in large circles despite maintaining a consistent bearing on my compass. The forest itself seemed to be shifting around me, presenting different configurations of trees and terrain each time I passed through what should have been the same location. Trails that led uphill in one direction somehow led uphill when I turned around and retraced my steps. Water flowed in directions that contradicted the topography, and the sun seemed to move across the sky in patterns that did not match the expected seasonal progression. On what I believed was my 8th day, I discovered another campsite that contained evidence of my previous occupation. This time, I found the remains of multiple fires in different locations around the site, suggesting that I had used this same location several times during my journey. Personal items that I had no memory of leaving behind were scattered around the area, including pieces of gear that I was certain were still in my backpack. The psychological stress of the situation began to take a severe toll on my mental state. I started to doubt my own memories and perceptions, wondering if I was experiencing some form of breakdown that was causing me to misinterpret normal wilderness experiences as supernatural phenomena. But the physical evidence of my multiple visits to the same campsites could not be explained by psychological factors alone. My food ran out on what my journal indicated was day 11, though my memory suggested I had been hiking for only 8 days. I began rationing my emergency supplies while desperately searching for any sign of human civilization or other hikers who might be able to help me navigate out of whatever maze I had become trapped in. It was on day 13 that I finally encountered another person. A day hiker appeared on the trail ahead of me, walking in the opposite direction with the confident stride of someone familiar with the area. When I called out to him for help, he stopped and listened to my explanation of being lost and disoriented for nearly 2 weeks. The day hiker looked at me with obvious concern and told me that I was less than 2 miles from a major road crossing where I could flag down a ride to the nearest town. He gave me detailed directions that seemed simple and straightforward, pointing out landmarks that I should follow to reach safety within a few hours. But when I followed his directions, I found myself back at one of the familiar campsites I had used multiple times during my ordeal. The day hiker was nowhere to be seen, and there was no evidence that anyone had recently passed through the area. I began to suspect that he had been another manifestation of whatever force was keeping me trapped in this endless loop. On day 14, I finally escaped by abandoning all attempts at logical navigation and simply walking downhill while ignoring my compass and GPS readings. This approach eventually led me to a stream that I followed to a road where I was able to get help from passing motorists. When I was rescued, I learned that I had been reported as an overdue hiker 6 days earlier, and search teams had been looking for me throughout the area where I thought I had been trapped. But the searchers found no trace of my presence in any of the locations I described, and my GPS track showed a confused pattern of overlapping circles and impossible routes that covered hundreds of miles in terrain that should have limited me to much shorter distances. The medical examination I received after my rescue showed signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition consistent with someone who had been lost in the wilderness for exactly 14 days. But my planned 5-day hike should never have lasted that long, and I still cannot explain how I became trapped in a section of forest that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. I no longer hike alone in unfamiliar areas, and I always carry emergency communication devices that allow me to call for help regardless of my location. Some parts of these mountains operate according to rules that human understanding cannot grasp, and getting lost in them means more than simply losing the trail. My name is Natalie, and I have always been drawn to the hidden places that most hikers never discover. While others stick to marked trails and established campsites, I prefer to explore the forgotten corners of these ancient mountains where few have ventured. What I found last September in the caves beneath Blood Mountain in Georgia proved that some places are forgotten for very good reasons. Blood Mountain has always held a reputation for being one of the most mysterious and unsettling peaks along the entire Appalachian Trail. The name itself comes from a Cherokee legend about a great battle between rival tribes that stained the mountain's rocks red with blood. Modern hikers often report feeling uncomfortable while camping in the area, describing an oppressive atmosphere that seems to press down on them like a physical weight. I was drawn to explore Blood Mountain specifically because of these stories. As an amateur speleologist, I was particularly interested in the extensive cave systems that honeycomb the mountain's interior. Most of these caves are unmarked and uncharted, accessible only to those willing to venture off established trails and navigate through dense forest to reach hidden entrances. My research had identified several potential cave openings on the eastern slope of the mountain, in an area that sees virtually no foot traffic from regular hikers. I planned a 3-day expedition to locate and explore these caves, carrying specialized equipment including headlamps, ropes, and emergency supplies designed for underground exploration. The hike to reach the cave system took most of the first day, following game trails and unmarked paths through increasingly dense forest. The atmosphere on Blood Mountain was immediately different from other peaks I had explored. The forest was unusually quiet, with very few bird calls or sounds from small animals. Even the wind seemed muffled, creating an unnatural stillness that made every sound I made feel amplified and intrusive. I found the first cave entrance late in the afternoon, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines and partially blocked by fallen rocks. The opening was larger than I had expected, easily wide enough for a person to enter without crawling. Cool air flowed out of the cave mouth, carrying an unusual smell that I could not immediately identify. The cave entrance led to a narrow passage that descended steeply into the mountain's interior. My headlamp revealed smooth limestone walls that showed clear evidence of water erosion over thousands of years. After about 50 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber with multiple tunnels branching off in different directions. It was in this main chamber that I made my first disturbing discovery. The walls were covered with carved symbols that appeared to be very old, etched deep into the limestone with tools that had left distinctive marks. The symbols were not random scratches or graffiti, but appeared to be organized into patterns that suggested some kind of written language or ceremonial markings. The carvings covered nearly every available surface in the chamber, from floor to ceiling, creating an overwhelming display that would have taken years to complete. Some of the symbols were simple geometric shapes, while others were more complex designs that resembled abstract representations of human or animal figures. What made the symbols particularly unsettling was their obvious age, combined with evidence that they had been maintained and refreshed over time. Some sections showed clear signs of recent work, with sharp edges and clean lines that contrasted with the weathered appearance of older carvings. Someone had been regularly visiting this cave to continue the work of whoever had originally created this underground gallery. As I photographed the symbols for later study, I noticed that many of them were arranged around small alcoves carved into the chamber walls. These alcoves appeared to be designed to hold objects, and several still contained items that made my blood run cold. There were animal bones arranged in specific patterns, collections of what appeared to be human teeth, and small bundles of organic material that had been preserved by the cave's cool, dry environment. The alcoves were clearly part of some kind of ritual system that had been active for a very long time. The variety of materials and their different states of preservation suggested that offerings had been placed here repeatedly over many years, possibly decades or even longer. I decided to explore one of the side passages leading deeper into the cave system, hoping to find more conventional geological features that would make the expedition feel less like trespassing in someone's underground temple. The passage I chose was smaller than the main chamber, requiring me to crawl in some sections, but eventually opened into another large space. This second chamber was even more disturbing than the first. The walls were covered with symbols similar to those in the main chamber, but these carvings showed clear evidence of being much more recent. Some were still sharp enough to catch and reflect my headlamp beam, as if they had been completed within the past few months. More alarming was the discovery of a makeshift altar in the center of the chamber. The structure was built from carefully stacked stones and appeared to be actively maintained, with fresh materials arranged on its surface. There were bones that still showed traces of flesh, plant materials that had not yet dried completely, and other organic substances that I preferred not to examine too closely. The altar was surrounded by a circle of symbols carved directly into the cave floor, creating a ceremonial space that was obviously still in regular use. Wax drippings around the perimeter indicated that candles or torches were frequently burned in this location, and the air carried the faint smell of smoke mixed with other odors that I could not identify. As I was documenting this second chamber, I began to hear sounds coming from deeper in the cave system. At first, I thought the sounds might be water dripping or wind moving through hidden passages. But as I listened more carefully, I realized that something large was moving through the tunnels beyond my current location. The sounds had a rhythmic quality that suggested deliberate movement rather than random animal activity. Whatever was making them was approaching my location slowly and methodically, pausing occasionally as if listening for sounds that would reveal my presence. I turned off my headlamp and waited in complete darkness, hoping that whatever was in the caves with me would pass by without detecting me. But the sounds continued to get closer, accompanied by what seemed like whispered voices speaking in a language I did not recognize. The voices had a chanting quality that suggested some kind of ritual or ceremony was taking place in the deeper parts of the cave system. The words were too faint and distorted by the cave acoustics for me to make out individual syllables, but the rhythm and tone suggested that multiple people were involved in whatever was happening. I realized that I had stumbled into an active ceremonial site that was still being used by people who would not appreciate the presence of an uninvited observer. The recent carvings, fresh offerings, and ongoing ritual activity meant that I was trespassing in a sacred space that was very much alive and protected. I began moving as quietly as possible back toward the cave entrance, but the passage seemed longer and more complex than I remembered from my initial exploration. I took several wrong turns and found myself in unfamiliar chambers that I was certain I had not seen before. The sounds of movement and chanting continued throughout my attempted escape, sometimes seeming to come from directly ahead of me, sometimes from behind, and occasionally from passages that ran parallel to my route. Whatever group was conducting their ceremony in the deeper caves was clearly aware of my presence and was possibly trying to cut off my retreat. When I finally reached the main chamber, I discovered that my route to the entrance was blocked. Fresh stones had been carefully arranged across the passage, not enough to completely seal it, but sufficient to make exit difficult and noisy. Someone had been in this chamber while I was exploring the deeper caves, and they had deliberately tried to trap me underground. I managed to move enough of the stones to squeeze through the passage and reach the cave entrance, but the effort took nearly an hour and made enough noise to alert anyone in the area to my location. When I finally emerged into daylight, I discovered that my camping gear had been disturbed and rearranged in patterns that matched the symbols I had seen carved in the cave walls. My tent had been collapsed and the fabric arranged in geometric shapes. My food supplies had been removed from their containers and organized into small piles that formed circular patterns around my campsite. Even my hiking boots had been repositioned to point toward the cave entrance in a way that seemed deliberately symbolic. I packed my remaining gear as quickly as possible and hiked out of the area without stopping to rest or eat. The entire descent from Blood Mountain felt like a retreat from something ancient and powerful that did not want its secrets exposed to the outside world. I never reported my discovery of the cave system to park authorities, partly because I had no desire to return to the area, and partly because I suspected that whatever was happening in those underground chambers was something that should be left undisturbed by outside interference. Blood Mountain keeps its secrets for good reasons, and some mysteries are better left unsolved by those who value their safety more than their curiosity. My name is Alexander, and I have been photographing wildlife in remote wilderness areas for over 12 years. I thought I had encountered every type of animal behavior these mountains could produce, from the curious to the territorial to the simply unpredictable. What stalked me for 3 days through the backcountry of Tennessee last October challenged everything I believed about the intelligence and intentions of the creatures that call these ancient forests home. I was conducting a solo photography expedition in the Cherokee National Forest, specifically targeting black bears during their pre-hibernation feeding period. This time of year offers some of the best opportunities to observe and photograph bears in their natural habitat, as they focus intensively on building fat reserves for the coming winter months. I had planned a 4-day backpacking trip to reach areas where bears congregate around natural food sources. The first day of hiking took me deep into old-growth forest where human presence is minimal and wildlife behavior remains largely uninfluenced by contact with people. I established my base camp near a stream that provided both water access and excellent sight lines for wildlife observation. The area showed abundant signs of recent bear activity, including fresh scat, claw marks on trees, and well-used trails leading to nearby berry patches. On the second morning, I encountered my first bear of the trip. The animal appeared at the edge of a clearing about 100 yards from my position, moving with the characteristic shambling gait of a large male black bear. I estimated his weight at over 300 pounds, making him one of the largest bears I had ever observed in the wild. I immediately began photographing him through my telephoto lens, excited by the opportunity to document such an impressive specimen. What struck me as unusual about this bear was his apparent awareness of my presence combined with his complete lack of typical bear behavior in response to detecting a human. Most bears will either flee immediately upon sensing people or display obvious signs of agitation and territorial posturing. This bear simply stood at the edge of the clearing and watched me with an intensity that felt distinctly unnatural. The bear remained motionless for nearly 20 minutes, never taking his eyes off my position. During this time, he showed no interest in foraging for food or engaging in any of the normal activities that would bring a bear to this type of location. He seemed to be studying me with the focused attention of a predator evaluating potential prey. When the bear finally moved, he did not retreat into the forest as I expected. Instead, he began walking slowly along the perimeter of the clearing, maintaining the same distance from my position while changing his angle of observation. His movement had a deliberate quality that suggested he was positioning himself for a better view rather than simply passing through the area. I continued photographing his behavior but began to feel increasingly uncomfortable about the situation. The bear's actions seemed more calculated and purposeful than anything I had observed in over a decade of wildlife photography. He was clearly aware of my exact location and was actively choosing to remain in the area despite my presence. After completing his circuit of the clearing, the bear disappeared into the forest. But rather than feeling relieved by his departure, I had the distinct impression that he had not actually left the area but had simply moved to a position where I could not see him. The feeling of being watched persisted long after he had vanished from sight. That evening, as I prepared dinner at my campsite, I noticed movement in the tree line surrounding my location. The same bear was visible between the trees, positioned about 50 yards away and maintaining his vigil over my activities. He remained motionless except for the occasional movement of his head as he tracked my movements around the campsite. The bear's behavior was so unusual that I began to question whether I was actually observing a normal wild animal or something else entirely. His posture was wrong for a typical black bear, appearing more upright and human-like than the forward-leaning stance characteristic of his species. His movements also seemed too fluid and coordinated, lacking the somewhat clumsy quality that makes bears appear endearing despite their size and power. Throughout the night, I was aware of the bear's continued presence around my campsite. I could hear him moving through the forest in slow, measured steps that suggested he was patrolling the perimeter of my location rather than simply wandering through his territory. The sounds never moved far enough away to indicate that he had lost interest in my presence. On the third day, the bear began following me as I moved through the forest. He maintained a consistent distance of approximately 100 yards, always staying just within sight but never approaching close enough to pose an obvious threat. When I stopped to photograph other wildlife or scenic locations, he would stop as well and wait for me to resume hiking. The bear's tracking behavior was so precise and persistent that I began to suspect he had some specific purpose in mind beyond simple curiosity about my presence. He seemed to be herding me in a particular direction, appearing ahead of me on certain trails while remaining behind me on others, effectively controlling my route through the forest. Most disturbing was the bear's apparent ability to predict my movements and intentions. He would position himself at locations where I planned to stop for rest or photography before I had made any obvious indication of my intentions. He seemed to understand not just where I was going, but why I was going there and what I planned to do when I arrived. By the afternoon of the third day, I had become genuinely frightened by the bear's behavior. His actions suggested a level of intelligence and planning ability that went far beyond anything documented in scientific literature about black bear cognition. He was not simply following me out of curiosity, but was actively stalking me with what appeared to be deliberate intent. I decided to change my planned route and head directly toward the nearest marked trail that would take me back to civilization. But when I attempted to alter my course, the bear began displaying signs of agitation for the first time since our initial encounter. He moved closer to my position and began making vocalizations that did not sound like typical bear communications. The sounds he produced were lower and more complex than normal bear vocalizations, with a rhythmic quality that almost resembled attempts at speech. The vocalizations seemed designed to communicate specific information rather than simply express emotion or territorial claims. When I continued moving toward the main trail despite his obvious displeasure, the bear began following me more closely and aggressively. He would appear directly on the path ahead of me, forcing me to alter my route, then position himself to block alternative routes that would take me toward areas of higher human activity. I realized that the bear was actively trying to prevent me from leaving his territory, using his size and presence to control my movements in ways that kept me isolated in remote areas where no other people would be likely to encounter us. His behavior suggested that he had specific plans for our interaction that required continued isolation from outside interference. On my final night in the forest, the bear abandoned all pretense of maintaining distance from my campsite. He positioned himself less than 30 yards away and remained there throughout the night, never sleeping or relaxing his vigilance. His eyes reflected the light from my campfire with an intelligence that seemed distinctly non-animal in its focus and intensity. I spent that night awake and alert, keeping my fire burning bright and maintaining constant awareness of the bear's position. Several times during the night, he rose to his full height on his hind legs and remained standing for extended periods, a posture that black bears typically maintain only briefly for scent detection or threat assessment. At dawn, I packed my gear as quickly as possible and began a rapid hike toward the main trail. The bear followed me for the first several miles, but gradually fell behind as I maintained a pace that was faster than his preferred travel speed. When I finally reached the marked trail system, he disappeared into the forest without any sign of his previous intense interest in my activities. I reported the encounter to park rangers, but was told that unusual bear behavior is not uncommon during pre-hibernation feeding periods when the animals are under stress to build adequate fat reserves. The rangers suggested that the bear had simply become habituated to human presence and was exhibiting curiosity rather than threatening behavior. But I know what I observed during those 3 days was not normal animal behavior. The bear's actions showed a level of planning, intelligence, and purposeful intent that suggested something far more complex than a wild animal's response to encountering a human in its territory. I still photograph wildlife in remote areas, but I no longer venture into regions where large predators might view me as something other than a temporary intrusion into their domain. Some animals in these mountains operate according to rules that human understanding has not yet discovered. And crossing paths with them can lead to encounters that challenge our assumptions about the natural world. My name is Abigail, and I have been a trail guide and wilderness educator for over 15 years. I thought I knew every established path, unmarked route, and hidden trail in the Blue Ridge Mountains. What happened to me last June proved that some trails in these ancient hills exist according to their own rules, leading hikers not just to different places but to different realities entirely. I was conducting a solo reconnaissance hike to evaluate a new route for guided tours when I discovered a trail that appeared on none of my maps or GPS systems. The path was well maintained and clearly marked with professional trailblazers, but it branched off from the main Appalachian Trail in a location where I was certain no side trail had existed during my previous visits to the area. The trail markers were painted in the standard white rectangular blazes used throughout the Appalachian Trail system, but they included additional symbols that I did not recognize from any official trail marking system. The symbols appeared to be directional indicators, but they pointed in directions that did not correspond to any known destinations or trail intersections. What initially attracted me to explore this mysterious trail was its obvious quality and maintenance. The path was expertly constructed with proper drainage, stable footing, and clear sight lines that indicated professional trail building techniques. Someone had invested considerable time and resources into creating a hiking experience that rivaled the best sections of the official trail system. The trail began with a gentle ascent through mixed hardwood forest, typical of the region. The walking was pleasant and the scenery was spectacular, offering views of distant ridges and valleys that I had never seen from this particular vantage point. The path seemed to follow natural contours of the landscape while providing access to scenic overlooks and interesting geological features. After hiking for what I estimated was about 3 miles, I encountered the first group of other hikers using the trail. They were a family consisting of 2 adults and 3 children, all properly equipped with hiking gear and displaying the confident demeanor of experienced trail users. When I asked them about their destination and how they had learned about this particular route, they gave me information that made no sense. They told me they were hiking from Damascus, Virginia to Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, following what they described as the traditional Appalachian Trail route. But the location where I had encountered them was nowhere near the established trail corridor between those 2 points, and their described itinerary would require them to cover impossible distances given the terrain and their apparent pace of travel. When I tried to explain that they seemed to be off the main trail system, they looked at me with confusion and showed me their guidebook and maps. The materials they carried appeared to be official Appalachian Trail publications, but they described a route that differed significantly from the established trail I knew well. Their maps showed the path we were currently following as the main trail, with the route I considered standard marked as an alternate or emergency bypass. The family continued on their way, heading in a direction that should have led them into impassable terrain according to my understanding of the local topography. But they walked with confidence and certainty as if they were following a well-known and frequently traveled route toward a destination they expected to reach without difficulty. As I continued exploring the mysterious trail, I encountered several more groups of hikers, all of whom gave me similar information about their routes and destinations. They all believed they were following the standard Appalachian Trail, and they all carried maps and guidebooks that showed this path as the official route through the region. Most disturbing was the discovery that these hikers represented different time periods of trail use. Some carried modern lightweight gear and used current terminology for trail features and regulations. Others had equipment and clothing that appeared to be from several decades earlier, and they referenced trail conditions and landmarks that had not existed for many years. One elderly hiker I encountered claimed to have been following this route annually for over 40 years, beginning in the 1970s when trail maintenance and marking systems were less standardized than today. He described changes to the trail over the decades that matched the historical development of the official Appalachian Trail. But he was describing changes to a route that I was certain had never existed. As the day progressed, I began to realize that I was not simply exploring an unmarked trail, but had somehow entered a version of the trail system that operated according to different rules than the reality I thought I understood. The other hikers I encountered were not lost or confused, but were following a legitimate trail that existed parallel to the one I knew. The landscape itself seemed to shift subtly as I continued hiking. Familiar landmarks appeared in unexpected locations, and the views from overlook showed terrain configurations that differed from my memory of the regional topography. The changes were not dramatic enough to be immediately obvious, but accumulated over time to create the impression that I was walking through a familiar area that had been somehow altered or rearranged. By late afternoon, I had hiked much farther than should have been possible given the terrain and my normal pace. My GPS showed that I had covered over 15 miles, but my physical condition and energy level suggested that I had hiked only half that distance. The device also showed my location as being several miles from where I believed I was based on the landmarks and trail features I could observe. When I tried to turn back toward my starting point, I discovered that the trail behind me had changed. The path I had followed to reach my current location was no longer visible, and the blazes that had guided me this far now pointed only in the forward direction. The trail seemed to exist only as a one-way route that prevented hikers from returning to their point of origin. I encountered a group of 3 hikers who claimed to have been walking this same trail for several weeks, covering thousands of miles while maintaining the same pace and energy level throughout their journey. They described passing through dozens of towns and trail landmarks, but their physical appearance and the condition of their gear suggested they had been hiking for only a few days at most. When I asked them about their experiences on the trail, they told me stories about encounters with other hikers, trail conditions, and weather events that spanned multiple seasons and years. They seemed to be experiencing time differently than normal, living through extended periods of trail life while aging only days or weeks in the process. The 3 hikers invited me to continue traveling with them, claiming that the trail led to destinations and experiences that could not be reached by following conventional routes. They described a network of interconnected paths that existed throughout the Appalachian mountain system, accessible only to those who abandoned traditional concepts of distance, time, and destination. As evening approached, I made the decision to leave the trail despite the apparent impossibility of retracing my route. I pushed through the forest in what I believed was the direction of the main trail system, fighting through dense undergrowth and difficult terrain in an effort to reach familiar territory. The journey back to known trails took several hours of challenging bushwhacking, but eventually I emerged onto a section of the official Appalachian Trail that I recognized. When I checked my GPS, I discovered that I was only about 2 miles from where I had first encountered the mysterious trail, despite having hiked over 15 miles during the day. I attempted to relocate the trail entrance the following day, bringing additional maps and GPS equipment to document its location and characteristics. But despite searching the exact area where I remembered finding the trailhead, I could find no evidence that such a path had ever existed. The forest showed no signs of trail construction or maintenance, and there were no blazes or markers in the area. I reported my experience to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and local park authorities, but was told that no unofficial trails existed in the area I described. The maps and GPS data I had recorded during my hike showed impossible routes through terrain that should have been impassable, and my photographic documentation revealed landmarks and trail features that did not correspond to any known locations. I have continued to search for the trail during subsequent visits to the area, but have never again encountered the path or the hikers who seem to exist within its alternate reality. Sometimes I wonder if they are still out there, walking endless miles through a version of these mountains where time and distance operate according to different rules, following trails that lead to destinations that exist only for those who know how to find them. The Appalachian Mountains hold many secrets, And some of the paths that wind through these ancient hills lead to places that cannot be found on any map or reached by conventional